On a night when it was pouring with rain, a young, beautiful girl got into an odd police car. At night in the city, it is raining heavily and thunder is rumbling. A girl was at home watching TV. The fireplace matches kept burning when suddenly the phone rang. As she had received an impromptu call from a friend, she hurriedly got dressed, grabbed an umbrella, and got ready to go to her friend's house for a party. With an umbrella in hand, the girl walked down the dark streets. Because of the faulty wiring of the street lamps caused by the heavy rain, the girl could only rely on the light of the flashlight to see the way. Suddenly, a police car stopped next to the girl and two police officers approached. In a very gentle tone, they said that they were concerned for her safety, so they were going to give her a ride. The girl was very surprised by this, because police in the United States don't take care of civilians in such a considerate way. Those cops are just guys who get paid to do nothing. But after seeing the badges they handed over, she let her guard down because in the girl's mind, no one would dare to impersonate a police officer. As a bolt of lightning illuminated the entire street, she spotted the two eager cops with the corners of their mouths turned up in a strange expression. But the girl didn't think much of it, her head leaning against the window of the car, listening to the sound of the rain hitting the windows, fantasizing that she would be able to enjoy the party when she got to her friend's house. But it wasn't until she watched the police car speed through the pouring rain, only to get further and further away from the destination she was headed to. It was only then that the panicked girl carefully recalled the actions of the two cops, their sudden concern, and that odd smile. It was then she remembered that there had been a news story on TV. Two local serial killers who specialized in murdering girls would pose as police officers, and after luring them into their cars, they would take them home and then torture and violate them until they finally murdered them again. This is a true crime story about the Hillside Stranglers. The Hillside Stranglers is a reference to the nickname of Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bono Jr. Kenneth Bianchi was born on May 22, 1951 in Rochester, New York City. Kenneth's mother was a prostitute with a penchant for alcohol, and his biological father was unknown, meaning that he was most likely the child of one of his mother's clients. Kenneth's mother is trying not to let this unwanted child drag down her quality of life. At the outset, she puts Kenneth up for adoption to a local welfare agency and then to other people. However, Kenneth displayed a short-tempered personality early on and would throw away what he could get his hands on when no one was looking. He would also viciously sink his teeth into his adoptive mother's breasts while she was breastfeeding him. Despite Kenneth's above-average intelligence, after seeing the ways in which he deceived others, his foster mother sent him to a private Catholic school in an attempt to limit his violent behavior. However, instead of restricting his violent thoughts, the strict religious system influenced his expectations of women, who he often thought were perfectly compatible with the Catholic standard of purity. But after coming into contact with many women, Kenneth realizes that most of the women he meets are not pure. They are all too open. However, by chance, Kenneth hears about his biological mother, leading to a gradual disillusionment with women and a distorted view of them. At the age of 13, his adoptive father died due to pneumonia, so after his adoptive mother ran out of privileges, she went and got a couple of jobs to try and keep the family afloat. However, due to financial pressures, Kenneth went back to public school and attended classes. In school, Kenneth was very motivated, and his classmates around him thought he was a very nice person. So after graduation, he married his high school sweetheart. During their 8 months together, Kenneth's wife realized that he was very immature and would only live in his own fantasies every day and would not get a job. In particular, Kenneth could not even take care of his own life, and his wife helped him every time, so they divorced. Irritated by his ex-wife, Kenneth immediately drops out of college, and after a long and painful job search, he finally finds a job in a jewelry store, where he is responsible for protecting the store employees as well as the jewels, i.e., he becomes a security guard. But Kenneth didn't think the jewelry in the jewelry store was safe, and he felt there was a safer place suitable for storing the jewelry, so he would often steal some of the jewelry and take it home. The jewelry became the capital for Kenneth to show off in front of his girlfriend and some prostitutes. However, since Kenneth had committed many thefts, he gave up his job and fled to Los Angeles in order not to be arrested by the police. In Los Angeles, he shares an apartment with his cousin Angelo Bono. Angelo is a very vicious man, a sadist who especially likes to control people's minds. and his history of sexual violence impresses Kenneth. Since they are both people who want to get something for nothing in a short exchange, Angelo convinces Kenneth. They contact some of the prostitutes and agree to become their agents, responsible for keeping them safe as well as finding them more clients, and they receive a certain amount of payment as a salary. Because of their personalities and their penchant for abusing the girls, their pimping business wasn't too successful. Of note is the fact that 2 of the girls couldn't take the sexual abuse from Angelo. They ran away late one night while Angelo and Kenneth were out looking for clients. They even stole some money. Upon learning that the 2 prostitutes had escaped, Angelo was so furious that he broke a piece of glass with his hand so hard that, although it caused him to pay for stitches afterward, it unsurprisingly shook the other prostitutes so that they never ran away again. But Kenneth is used to the unearned money, so he calls out to Angelo and prepares to go out and find more girls to work for them. Inside a dingy bar, Kenneth sends a sum of money to the bar's bartender, trying to get some information out of him about girls who want to make money. Looking at the blinking light bulbs above his head and the drunks that are laying on the floor, Kenneth is in an irritated mood, but by the time the bartender introduces him to a girl, excitedly he walks out of the door of the bar with Angelo in tow and immediately drives to the girl. But unfortunately for the girl, even though she wants to make money very badly, she doesn't agree to be a prostitute. Much to their dismay, Angelo and Kenneth pay for another message from one of the prostitutes, which includes the names of some of the prostitutes as well as some of their clients. But their luck is very bad and they get scammed again. Angry Angelo and Kenneth tried to catch the prostitute who cheated them right then and there, but even after searching the whole street, they couldn't find it. Late one night, Kenneth is drinking at a bar, depressed and sipping on his booze. But something a customer at the table next to him says amuses him because he hears something about the prostitute who cheated on them that night. So he hurriedly called out to Angelo, and together they headed to a dark alley where the prostitute's friend, Yolanda Washington, was. The alley was pitch black, with only the sound of a leaking pipe nearby. They crept into a house in the alley, and since the lock on the door was deteriorating, they easily opened the room, then immediately rushed into the bedroom, grabbed a pillow and covered Yolanda's head. Even though Yolanda continued to struggle, tearing at Kenneth's clothes with her hands and attempting to scratch Kenneth with her fingernails, her strength weakened over time until she passed out. A few minutes later, Angelo brought a tub of cold water and poured it over Yolanda's body, who immediately awoke from the cold water. Immediately afterward, Kenneth opened his mouth and inquired about the whereabouts of the prostitute, and as he spoke, he burned Yolanda with a cigarette. Even though Yolanda cried that she was not sure, Angelo and Kenneth did not let her go, and they took a stick and kept beating Yolanda until bruises appeared on her body. They then undressed Yolanda and violated her. However, it didn't end there. They took a piece of cloth and gagged Yolanda's mouth and nose and killed her straight away. Relying on the darkness of the night, they drove right up to the entrance of Forest Lawn Cemetery. When no one was around, they dumped the body in the bush next to the entrance. Due to bad taste, Kenneth also placed the body in a very strange position. This was the first murder done by the Hillside Stranglers, and this murder pushed them completely over the edge and set off a wave of horrific killings. The next victim was a teenager, 15 years old at the age of enjoying her youth. Her name was Judith Miller, a girl with long flowing black hair, a native of Los Angeles. On that day, she was planning to take a trip to Glendale Hills, a famous Los Angeles attraction, to vent her depressed feelings. Because Judith had a fight with her family, feeling angry, she chose to run away from home. But being on her way to her destination, Judith was targeted by Kenneth. At that time, Kenneth and Angelo were on their way running around looking for their prey. Their first thought was that there must be a large number of out-of-town tourists in the attraction. However, even if they killed those out-of-town tourists, the time of day would cause no one to notice the out-of-town tourists were missing, so they arrived at a park close to Glendale Hills. In the car, Kenneth and Angelo are arguing over money when a girl passes them by, and that girl is also Judith. For Kenneth and Angelo, who have already tasted murder, a lively girl is their best prey. On October 31st, 1977, Judith's body was found in a garden near Glendale Hill. According to the autopsy report, she had been strangled, and when her body was first found, she was disheveled and her bare legs were deliberately diamond-shaped. Time passed slowly and a third victim emerged. Her name was Elissa Caston, and she was only 21 years old, a dancer and waitress working in North Hollywood. On that day, November 5th, 1977, she had the misfortune of meeting Kenneth and Angela. Despite Elissa's constant struggles, she appeared weak against the beating of the two young, strong adult males, and she was then forcibly violated and eventually brutally murdered. 3 days later, on November 9th, 1977, the body of 18-year-old prostitute Jill Barkham was found in North Beverly Hills with the same characteristics as the first 3 victims. As the LAPD investigated the 3 murders, they realized that all of the victims were either some prostitutes or runaway children. So they suspected that the murders might have been committed by a serial killer rather than a random incident. And in that time period, there was no DNA testing, no criminal gene pool, which meant that they had no way of finding out who the killer was. However, the murders at Hillside Stranglers didn't stop there. Within just 1 month, there were 3 more victims, all of whose bodies were found on various hillsides. At this point, the media began to report heavily, as these victims were not marginalized members of society, as they had been before, but very vulnerable young girls. Since all of the victims were assaulted and then murdered, people in Los Angeles began to become fearful, especially young girls who were afraid to go out at night, or even step out of their homes alone for fear that a killer might appear in the shadows at any moment to murder them. And in a very detailed story reported on the website, they revealed the results of the victim's autopsy. They state that the killer injects cleaning fluids into the girls to give them a very painful physical reaction, beating and torturing them until they die. And the LAPD also based their reports on the bodies of these victims. They discovered a horrifying fact. They described the killer as being like a blank sheet of paper at the time of the first murder, not knowing anything. But he had a very strong ability to learn, like he was constantly refining his sadistic techniques. And the detectives also discovered a horrifying fact. They guessed that there was more than one murderer because it was impossible for one person to do the kidnapping as well as the murder and clean up all the traces of the crime in a short period of time. So they thought that so many murders were done by 2 people. However, the fact that the detectives interrogated Kenneth during the investigation of the missing girls, because one of the girls lived in the same building as him, the detectives didn't realize that the Kenneth they were interrogating was one of the serial killers. When the detectives were questioning him, they just thought the young man was very polite and intelligent, so they didn't suspect him. As the busy LAPD continued to investigate the leads, within 10 days they found 2 more victims, 2 very young girls, a young 28-year-old, Jane King, and an 18-year-old, Lauren Wagner. Apparently, they had been subjected to unspeakable and inhumane torture before they were killed. And this time the torture was even more horrific, as according to the tests, one of the girls was burned alive in a fire by her killer while she was awake. This also means that the police's reasoning was correct, and that the killers were constantly refining their methods of torture. But in the meantime, the police got a very important clue. One of Lauren Wagner's neighbors said, shortly before Lauren disappeared, probably within a few hours, she had an argument with 2 men on the street. The 2 men looked Latino. One looked young and the other looked older, and they were parked next to a dark-colored car with a white roof. But since he was mowing the lawn in front of his house at the time, he wasn't quite sure what happened after that. With that piece of information, the police quickly ruled out non-Latino suspects and did an all-out search for information about the whereabouts of the car. But a few days later, a new victim emerged, a 22-year-old prostitute, Kimberly Martin. Although police expected the killer's behavior to become increasingly violent next, they didn't find any escalation of violence in Martin's case. Even though the LAPD was constantly investigating information about all the victims as they tried to figure out why the killer was targeting them, it was going nowhere because most of the victims were on the fringes of society, existences that no one would have noticed even if they had disappeared. A few weeks later, a new victim showed up, this time 23-year-old Cindy Lee Hudspeth, a waitress. It was early one sunny morning when a young man wanted to go out for a run while it was cool. As he ran slowly to the edge of a cliff, he noticed that the guardrail next to the road had been knocked away, and then he reached out to see that there was actually a car at the bottom of the cliff. In the spirit of wanting to save lives, he rushed around the side to the bottom of the cliff. Strangely enough, there was no one in the driver's seat, and the car looked like it had fallen off the cliff on its own. But when he looked down, he realized that there was a large dark red smear of blood on the rear of the car. Realizing that this was most likely a murder, the young man hurriedly called the police and explained everything. As the police arrived at the scene, they set up the guardrail, put on gloves, and cautiously opened the trunk of the car. A girl was lying on her side in the trunk. Her clothes were disheveled. There were signs of scratches on her skin, most notably the strangulation marks on her neck. So the police understood that this was another kidnapping and murder committed by the Hillside Stranglers. So the LAPD, as well as a large number of media outlets, kept reporting the news, warning all young women not to go out alone. As time went on, the Hillside Stranglers never found another young woman alone, so they disbanded the group. A few days later, Kenneth's girlfriend, Kelly Boyd, gave birth to a son. Tired of the hustle and bustle of Los Angeles and her distaste for Kenneth's lifestyle, she took the baby and headed right back to Washington State to live with her parents. Learning of his girlfriend's return home, Kenneth spends his days pleading to be reunited with her, spending his time begging Kelly for forgiveness. A soft-hearted Kelly eventually relented, though she demanded that Kenneth come to Washington State to live with her. Kenneth agrees, and returns to his normal life, taking a job as a security guard, where he doesn't continue to steal, but just settles into his duties as a security guard, taking care of the kids with Kelly. But the peaceful life didn't quell Kenneth's desire to kill, and even with a happy and fulfilling family, he is still constantly on the lookout for new victims. With Angelo out of the picture, he set out on his own. It was early one morning and two young girls were looking for work on the streets, Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder. Kenneth, who was standing guard in the security room, saw them and immediately went forward to inquire about them. After learning that the two young girls were looking for work, Kenneth had the bright idea to say that there was an employer around who happened to be hiring babysitters, and that they offered very generous benefits. Karen and Diane were naturally excited about the job, and asked Kenneth to take them to the employer's house to find out what it was really like. It was a very high-end looking house, and the girls were excited to tour the interior of the house when Kenneth made his move. He took a piece of cloth and blindfolded Karen, then kicked her down the stairs. Karen rolled from the second floor to the first floor and fainted due to the huge impact. And the panicked Diane didn't escape as she was directly choked unconscious by Kenneth's hand. The excited Kenneth immediately tied up the girls who had fallen into unconsciousness and woke them up by splashing them with cold water before beating them severely with a stick. When Kenneth heard Karen and Diane screaming, he became very excited and violated the girls by choking them and tearing their clothes. Until finally, feeling fatigued, Kenneth showed no mercy at all and murdered Karen and Diane directly with a rope. But without Angelo's help, Kenneth left many clues behind. As the detectives investigated, they easily discovered the traces Kenneth had left behind. In particular, Kenneth was arrested after the detectives found a piece of paper in Karen's car detailing that they were going to tour the house with Kenneth. Kenneth, who had never been hurt before, was also quick to tell the detectives about his accomplice Angelo, who was then also captured by the police within a few days. Finally, after a series of trials, Kenneth and Angelo were sentenced to life in prison. And Angelo died on September 21, 2002 at the age of 67 at the Calipatria State Prison in California due to heart problems. Today, however, Kenneth is still serving time in prison, and the latest news is that he will have a round of parole hearings in 2025, but it's almost impossible for the court to pass them.
Throughout history, one case remains shrouded in mystery, prompting speculation. Was it a misunderstanding or an elaborate series of murders? In 1947, the town of Loudoun, France famous for its paranormal events, was thrown into chaos by a bizarre case. On October 25th, a businessman passed away in the town. Although his doctors were convinced that the cause of death was uremia, the story didn't end there. After the businessman was buried, his friend wrote a letter to the prosecutor, suggesting that there might be more to the businessman's death and strongly urging a reinvestigation. After 2 years of public pressure, the police decided to revisit the case. In 1949, they exhumed the businessman's grave and conducted an autopsy. The results shocked the entire town. The medical examiner found 19.45 milligrams of arsenic in the businessman's body. Arsenic is a highly toxic chemical element and a key ingredient in rat poison. The town's tranquility was shattered as speculations and questions about the businessman's death surged. If someone had indeed plotted this murder, the entire town faced a potential poisoning threat. At this point, the letter writer revealed more information, stating, the businessman had confided in her that he was about to be poisoned because his wife had served him a bowl of soup and he saw her put some unknown liquid into it. The detectives then located Marie Bisnard, the businessman's wife. Marie was an ordinary-looking woman with a warm smile, making it hard for the detective to imagine her as the potential murderer. When questioned about the unknown liquid mentioned by her husband, Leon Bisnard, Marie remained silent. Without concrete evidence, the detectives could not arrest her and needed more proof to support their case. A few days later, an insider revealed crucial information. Most of Marie's relatives, as well as her husband, died of illnesses. They either died of tuberculosis or cerebral hemorrhage. None of them died naturally. All had unusual deaths, but no doctors noticed these odd patterns. The insider also disclosed that Marie had exhibited extreme selfishness and coldness from a young age. Born in Loudon in 1896, she married her cousin August Antony at 24, who died of tuberculosis 7 years later. A year later, Marie remarried Leon Bisnard, a small-town rope merchant. Their life appeared peaceful and prosperous, but was fraught with underlying tensions. 12 years later, 2 wealthy members of Leon's family died, leaving most of their inheritance to Leon's parents. However, the lure of money brought death. Leon's parents died one after another, his father from poisonous mushrooms and his mother from pneumonia within 3 months. Another heir, Leon's sister Lucy, committed suicide a few months later due to a mental breakdown. Consequently, as the sole heir, Leon received the entire estate. 3 months later, Marie's father also died of a cerebral hemorrhage, and his estate fell into Marie's hands. Immediately after, Leon gave a house to a wealthy couple who, due to years of work, had no time to have children. When they heard Leon was giving them the house, they saw it as an opportunity to recuperate. However, the couple soon died of pneumonia, and bizarrely, they will name Marie as the sole heir to their estate. The lure of money continued, and death kept reaping. Over the years, Marie and Leon's relatives died one after another. As a result, Marie and Leon acquired 6 houses, 2 hotels, a cafe, and several horse farms, becoming notably wealthy in the area. However, as Marie's background was exposed, rumors spread throughout the town, and Marie received multiple death threats. Another informant revealed even more chilling information. Marie had said Leon was cheating on her and that she was preparing for a divorce. If Leon disagreed, then arsenic would be the best alternative to divorce. With enough clues collected, the detectives decided to conduct a more in-depth investigation, exhuming 12 graves of Marie and Leon's relatives. When the autopsy reports came back, they were astonished. Traces of arsenic were found in 11 of the 12 corpses. Eventually, 52-year-old Marie was arrested on a hot morning and faced 11 charges of murder. In February 1952, Marie stood trial for the first time. The courtroom atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The prosecution accused Marie of poisoning several relatives with arsenic. They relied on forensic reports indicating high levels of arsenic in the victims' bodies. However, Marie's lawyers contested this claim. They challenged the forensic conclusions, arguing that the presence of arsenic alone did not prove poisoning, particularly since most of the victims' causes of death, tuberculosis, cerebral hemorrhage, and uremia could not be attributed to arsenic poisoning. The trial saw significant evidence conflicts, and the court could not reach a conclusion. The judge declared a mistrial and decided to create a new panel of 3 experts to re-examine the autopsy reports. 2 years later, during the second trial in 1954, the controversy over toxicological evidence resurfaced. Experts' inconsistent interpretations of arsenic poisoning complicated matters further. One expert even lost his temper on the witness stand and refused to continue testifying. The second trial was again declared a mistrial. This time, the court allowed Marie to post bail of 1,200,000 francs, enabling her to wait outside of prison for the third trial. On November 20th, 1961, Marie was called back to court. The prosecution and defense continued to dispute the scientific evidence. However, this time the trial concluded with a decisive verdict. Marie's lawyer brought in a witness who pointed out that the Loudon Cemetery's caretaker had planted potatoes near the graves and used arsenic-containing fertilizer. The lawyer suggested that arsenic could have entered the bodies through the soil and diffused into them via anaerobic bacteria. Faced with this explanation, experts conceded that their techniques were insufficient to definitively prove that the arsenic in the bodies resulted from Marie's poisoning, especially given the technical limitations of the time and the inability to completely rule out other possibilities. On December 12, 1961, after 3 hours and 25 minutes of deliberation, the jury acquitted Marie Besnard. She was finally exonerated, ending a legal battle that had lasted over a decade. Ironically, despite her eventual acquittal, the state was not obligated to compensate her for the years she spent in prison. A weary lawyer concluded that the case might be the best example of pro-cremation. Perhaps Marie wasn't a serial killer, or perhaps she was the world's most skilled serial killer. After all, nearly all her family members died of illness, and she was the ultimate beneficiary. Paul Bernardo has been selected as one of the notorious serial killers in Canadian history. Although he committed a series of rapes in Canada between 1987 and 1990, with at least 12 rapes and 4 attempted rapes, he was also involved in at least 3 murders. But he wasn't really a serial killer. He was a lustful demon made by an acquired influence. Paul Bernardo was never cut out to be a killer. It was just his perception that was altered in the home environment he grew up in. A person's upbringing determines what kind of person they will become in the future. An example of this would be if your father was a carpenter, then over the years you might also be interested in carpentry as a career. Paul Bernardo was born into a very bad family. His mother, Marilyn, and was adopted at a young age by a lawyer from Toronto, Canada. The family loved Marilyn so much that they always treated him well. But growing up in this coddled environment, Marilyn would think that everything was perfectly fine, so she meets her husband, Kenneth Bernardo, who grew up in another unfortunate family. Kenneth's father was a successful businessman, but he was not a good father or husband, because whenever he had a little setback in business, then he would beat his wife and children. As a result, Kenneth got into a bad habit, which is that he would treat young women with a morbid mentality. In 1960, Marilyn's boyfriend asked her to marry him, but her father refused because he had failed the so-called son-in-law test. But even the most successful people make mistakes. Marilyn's father had put Marilyn in Kenneth's trap just because Kenneth had passed the son-in-law test. Marilyn and Kenneth married in 1960 and settled in a middle-class neighborhood in the Scarborough area of Toronto, Canada, a beautiful community, but Marilyn and Kenneth's marriage was not a good one. They fought, and Kenneth would beat Marilyn just because he was like his father. Kenneth, like his father, would bully his wife whenever things didn't go his way. Marilyn was a very naive person who thought that she would be happy by going along with Kenneth, but she was proven wrong. Even after she gave birth to Kenneth's child, Kenneth didn't stop his bad behavior. Eventually, Marilyn ran away from the marriage. She cheated on her ex-boyfriend and gave birth to a child, but Kenneth was not repulsed by Marilyn's behavior. It didn't even matter to him. He tolerated Marilyn's infidelity and volunteered to be the child's biological father on the birth certificate. In August 1964, they named the child Paul Bernardo. And while Paul was growing up, his father, Kenneth, continued to harass young girls. He would hang out in the neighborhood at night, tailing young girls and peeking out windows to watch them change clothes, for which he was taken to court. But the worst was when he began sexually abusing his young daughter. And Paul's mother, Marilyn, who became self-absorbed because of her husband's beatings as well as her mind control, would overeat to the point that she became very obese, and because of her obesity, her depression became worse, so she stopped taking care of her family as well as her children, and instead hid herself in the basement of the house. And Paul lived in such a bad environment. He was originally a very friendly little boy who was happy every moment, especially when he smiled he would have dimples. So much so that many women would unconsciously pinch his cheeks every time they saw him, and to them Paul was just a very perfect child. Because Paul was polite and did well in school, especially when he was very cute in his Boy Scout uniform. Later, as he grew up, Paul would keep attending events, so he was the favorite in the hearts of the kids around him. Teenage girls also adored him because of his angelic appearance and shy, likable demeanor. The girls who dated Paul when he was in high school also thought Paul was a very considerate person. Intellectually, Paul was even better. He was smart, worked hard at his studies, and took on a number of school positions to take care of a range of after-school tasks. This was Paul's happiest time until, at the age of 16, he got into an argument with his mother, and Marilyn angrily said to Paul, "Who do you think you are? You're just an asshole, and you're not your father's real son?" After Paul saw the picture of his real father, his mind went blank, like a bullet hit his brain. After this, Paul's thoughts changed, and he began to mock his mother, calling her very sloppy and even saying that she was a whore. Because Paul realized his mother's unfaithfulness and his father's sick behavior, he began to hate his parents. So Paul started to hang out with some bad boys, and this had a very negative effect on his thinking. Paul followed them and stole and bullied girls together, and after this, Paul's attitude towards women changed dramatically. Before, Paul would treat the girls gently and considerately, and after this, he would order them to do something bad, and if they didn't agree, then Paul would verbally abuse as well as beat them. Around 1980, Paul graduated from Sir Wilfrid Laurier College. Paul and his friends were recruited by Amway, an American marketing company. And Paul learned a lot from this job, such as sales and business aspects and interpersonal relations. He also bought a lot of books and tapes from famous experts. At this time, Paul was all about making money, but it didn't last long. Paul left Amway after working for a while. When Paul stayed with his punk friends, they would go to the bar every night and drink. If there were some pretty girls who were attracted to their douchebaggery, they would lie to those naive girls that they were rich. And this lie would attract those naive girls, and then they would voluntarily sleep with Paul and the others. By the time Paul was studying at the University of Scarborough in Toronto, his mind had become distorted, and his temper had become so violent that he would seek out gentle girls for dates, humiliate them in public, and beat them up when he was in a bad mood. Paul also sells stolen goods. His friends rob passers-by in stores, and then Paul sells them at the university. Because Paul's desire for money is so powerful, no job's paycheck will allow him to squander it. So Paul starts a scam in which he swears to get a lot of money, but luckily no one is fooled. By the time Paul graduates from college, Paul takes a job as a junior accountant in order to make ends meet. And his girlfriend, tired of being tied up and beaten, breaks up with Paul. Paul, who was initiated by the girl to mention the breakup, felt angry because he was a controlling macho man, so he began to decide to take revenge on society. On May 4th, 1987, a 21-year-old girl was followed by Paul while she was riding a bus home late at night. She was walking alone on a late-night street, which was illuminated by streetlights as the girl made her way home, but Paul attacked her for half an hour. It was Paul's first attack and a nightmarish experience for the girl. On May 14, 1987, as if Paul had tasted a delicacy, he attacked a 19-year-old girl again, and the place of commission was in the backyard of a house. The girl panicked and called for help, but no one rescued her during that hour or so. On July 27, 1987, it was as if Paul was obsessed with the feeling of the girl's constant struggles and cries beneath him. He tried to carry out a third attack. Paul found a girl by the side of the street in the middle of the night, who was preparing to go home. He first assaulted the girl, trying to get her to follow him, but after the girl fought back, he got scared and then gave up the attack. On September 29, 1987, Paul again attempted to assault a 15-year-old girl by being so bold as to break into the girl's house illegally and then quietly enter her bedroom. The girl was sleeping, but Paul woke her up by sitting on top of her, and when she tried to cry out for help, Paul covered her mouth with his hand and then took out a knife and threatened the girl. And sensing something was wrong, the girl's mother, she entered the room and found Paul. Then when she was about to scream out loud, Paul fled. In October 1987, Paul met the girl of his dreams, a beautiful blonde called Karla Homolka, 17 years old, and in that year, Paul was 23 years old. When they meet, it's like Cupid's arrow has hit them both because they almost immediately take an interest in each other. Unlike the girls Paul had met before, Karla was totally supportive of Paul's idea of assaulting others and was totally okay with being abused by Paul. Karla was born in 1970 in Port Credit Hare, Ontario, Canada, to Karol Homolka, a traveling salesman and Czechoslovakian immigrant with a penchant for heavy drinking, and his wife, Dorothy Homolka, an employee of a geriatric clinic. She has two sisters, Lori and Tammy. Karla is a bright child and a good student, and her father loves her, but he also insults her and her mother and sisters when he is drunk. Almost all murderers will have an unfortunate family, a father who likes to beat his family and a mother who doesn't love her children. Living in this type of environment, Karla's temperament was also influenced by her father, and she became stubborn and overbearing, unable to get along with other children, yet she would socialize with people older than her, and this was a sick mentality because she enjoyed being abused. When Karla was in middle school, she experienced a depressive episode, and during that time she would dress in strange costumes and then hurt herself with a knife, and when she was caught by her parents, she would say, "I hurt myself just to get your love." During this time period, she had gone down the wrong path, and unfortunately, she didn't get any help from anyone. When Paul and Karla became a couple, Paul drove to see Karla twice a week and slowly took control of her entire life, deciding how she should dress, look, eat, and believe. Especially because Paul was so upset when he found out Karla wasn't a virgin when they first met. Paul's sarcastic comments about Karla being fat and ugly may have been compensatory, but Karla soon succumbed to Paul's mind control, even writing down Paul's instructions on a self-improvement checklist. When Paul and Karla are together, they role-play, with Paul playing the role of a master and Karla playing the role of an abused slave. During the time that these two demons spent together, more than a dozen girls were attacked by them. On December 16, 1987, Paul again attacked a 15-year-old girl. The following day, the Toronto Police Service issued a warning to women in Scarborough, particularly those riding the bus, because they had noticed that the girls were being followed after they got off the bus. On December 23, 1987, Paul attacked a 17-year-old girl again with a knife, threatening her with disfigurement if she wouldn't take it. And from this attack, Paul began to be known as the Scarborough Rapist. On April 18, 1988, a 17-year-old girl was attacked by Paul. On May 25, 1988, Paul was almost caught by a uniformed police officer as he was about to attack a pretty young girl. However, he was spotted by the policeman, and even though he was hiding under a tree, Paul immediately fled after spotting the policeman. On May 30, 1988, Paul again attacked an 18-year-old girl. On October 4, 1988, Paul again stalked a girl, but this time he was not successful because the girl was prepared and she bravely fought with Paul, but because Paul had a knife in his hand, she was stabbed twice by Paul at her thighs, as well as at her buttocks. Luckily, she didn't die, but only received 12 stitches in the wounds. On November 16, 1988, an 18-year-old girl was assaulted. On November 17, 1988, the police formed a task force to capture Paul. But despite a wealth of physical evidence and sketches of the killer that were not shown to the public, the investigation came up empty. And Carla knew what Paul was doing in the meantime. One of the victims claimed that Carla was present at the attack and recorded it on video camera, but the allegations were ignored by the police. On December 27, 1988, Paul's attack failed because a nearby neighbor chased Paul away at that time. On June 20, 1989, Paul's attack failed, and it was another brave girl who struggled with Paul before her screams caused a nearby neighbor to run away with scratches on Paul's face. On August 15, 1989, a 22-year-old girl was attacked. On November 21, 1989, Paul attacked a 15-year-old girl at a bus shelter. On December 22, 1989, Paul assaulted a 19-year-old girl. On May 26, 1990, Paul again attacked a 19-year-old girl. After so many victims appeared, the police published sketches of the killer in Toronto and the surrounding area and provided a great deal of information in order to prevent any more victims. Between May and September 1990, police collected DNA test samples from more than 130 suspects when they received 2 reports that the killer they were looking for was Paul Bernardo. The first was submitted by a bank employee. The second was submitted by the wife of one of Paul's closest friends, who told police that Paul had been set up as a suspect in a previous assault investigation, but that he had never been questioned and that he would often talk to people around him about his sick ideas. And when the police received this report, they weren't sure if they were going to take it seriously, but after examining both reports, they decided to question Paul. On November 20, 1990, the police formally questioned Paul. When the police mentioned Paul as to why he was being investigated, Paul admitted that it was suspicious that he looked like the killer's sketch. The police then concluded that they thought it was unlikely that such a well-educated young man would commit a crime, and Paul volunteered to give blood, saliva, and hair samples. And the interrogation, which lasted 35 minutes, ended with the police ruling that Paul was not the murderer. After the interrogation, Paul and Carla got engaged, and to celebrate this special day, Carla did something that outraged everyone. For she volunteers to give Paul her 15-year-old sister's virginity as a Christmas present. However, Paul is also very happy with this offer. Paul hatches a plan where he asks Carla to use drugs to knock out her sister Tammy that night, and also asks Carla to make sure that Tammy is a virgin at all times. Carla does a great job. She acts like a strict father and forbids any boys to come near Tammy. In Tammy's mind, she thinks that Carla is being nice to her. But the truth is, what she doesn't realize is that Carla is actually treating her like a commodity. Then, on a summer trip, Carla is ready to make her move, stealing a lot of sleeping pills from Tammy's workplace in order to knock her out. That night, she cooks a meal and puts some sleeping pills in it. After eating, Tammy did fall asleep, but only for a minute. On December 23rd, after Christmas dinner, Carla put a handful of sleeping pills in Tammy's drink, and the amount would put a cow to sleep. By the time Tammy started complaining about why her head was so dizzy, Paul and Carla had a strange smile on their faces because they knew in their hearts that the plan was about to be executed. And a few minutes later, Paul got the result he wanted. And Tammy woke up from the pain, but just as she was still thinking, Carla took a halothane-soaked rag and covered Tammy's mouth and nose. Tammy struggled with the pain and she kept trying to vomit. Carla continued to cover Tammy's mouth, and after a few minutes, Tammy stopped breathing. After Paul and Carla realized that Tammy had stopped breathing, they tried cardiac resuscitation, but it didn't work. Tammy was dead, so they set out to eliminate the evidence. They dressed Tammy and put her body in her bed. Because as soon as the autopsy was done, the coroners would realize it was a murder. So they disguised the scene as an accidental death. Then they called the police and claimed that Tammy choked to death on her own vomit. When the police arrived, although they noticed mysterious chemical burns on Tammy's face, the drugs in her system were not detected, and believing that the family would never murder a family member, the police concluded that Tammy's death was an accident. At Tammy's funeral, Paul did a very disgusting thing. He kept touching Tammy, who was lying in the casket. They even put a picture of them in the casket. 3 weeks after Tammy's death, Carla and Bernardo filmed a video called Fireside Chat at the Homolka residence. The video was ultimately considered as evidence in court because it began in the basement recreation room, and at some point the filming moved to Tammy's bedroom. While they were in the recreation room, Carla admitted to Paul that she liked it when Paul attacked Tammy, and she also said in the video that she wanted to leave a rose at Tammy's grave. In Paul and Carla's subsequent role-playing sessions, Carla would even dress up in Tammy's clothes to play the part of her poor sister. Paul was a demon of sexual desire, and Carla was like a believer who was voluntarily compelled by the demon. Shortly after Tammy's funeral, Carla's parents leave town and her other sister, Lori, goes to Mississauga to visit her grandparents. The house was empty at this time, just Paul and Carla, so they decided to do something about it. On January 12, 1991, a beautiful weekend, Paul went out hunting early in the morning, and a few hours later, a girl was kidnapped and brought home by Paul, who then attacked the girl while Carla watched. On April 6, 1991, Paul continued his attacks, this time in St. Catharines, Canada. At approximately 5:30 a.m., Paul abducted a 14-year-old girl. This attack was different from the previous one because Carla was also involved in the attack. The girl was in training at the time, but Carla kept waving at her from her car. When the girl approached, Paul immediately grabbed her and dragged her to a bush on the side of the road and attacked her. On June 7, 1991, Carla invited to the party a 15-year-old girl known as Jane Doe, a friend whom Carla had met 2 years earlier at a pet store. During this time, Carla had been taking Jane shopping as well as eating, after which she took Jane to a bar for drinks. When Jane got drunk, Carla immediately called Paul and asked him to come over and help bring the girl home, as Jane was Carla's wedding gift to Paul. By the time Jane woke up the next morning, she felt sore and weak, but she didn't think it was strange because it was her first time drinking. She just thought it was a side effect of being drunk and didn't realize in the slightest that she had been attacked. And Jane's story with the couple didn't end there. In August, she was once again invited by Carla, and then once again she was knocked out and once again attacked. On December 22nd, 1992, Jane visited the couple once again, and this time Carla forced her to have sex with Paul, after which she left distraught. Leslie Erin Manhefi, one of the 3 victims murdered by Paul and Carla, was born on July 5, 1976. She was born in the United States of America. Her father was an oceanographer with the Canadian Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans and was sometimes away from home for weeks at a time. Her mother, on the other hand, was a teacher. On the evening of June 14th, Leslie went to the funeral home to attend the wake of her friend Chris Evans, who had died in a car accident earlier in the week. After the wake, a group of teens met in the woods to comfort each other. A couple of her friends gave her a ride home just before 2 a.m. and decided to stay with her when they realized the side door was locked. Leslie told them the front door would be open and let them go home. But when Leslie realized that the front door was also locked, she walked to a payphone in a nearby plaza and called her friends to ask for a place to stay, which was denied. After a lengthy conversation, she said she had to go home to wake her mother to get in. On her way home, she met up with Paul, who was in the backyard looking for the victim. After learning that Leslie did not have a place to stay, he lured Leslie back to the car and took her to the house he shared with Carla. Later that day, a friend of Leslie's called Leslie's parents to check on Leslie and explained to them that Leslie had been locked out. Leslie's mother immediately began searching for her daughter, but of all places there was no sign of Leslie, and then on June 18th she filed formal papers requesting that her daughter be notified and arrested as a runaway. What she didn't realize, however, was that her daughter had already been kidnapped by Paul, and all the police could find was her body. During the first 24 hours of Leslie's abduction, Paul and Carla continually beat and assaulted Leslie and gave her a teddy bear to cuddle in between attacks. However, during Leslie's torture, her blindfold fell off and she clearly saw Paul and Carla's faces. So Paul kept strangling Leslie with wires and Carla used sedatives, just as they had done with Tammy's murder earlier, and Leslie died from their torture. Paul and Carla then moved Leslie's body to the basement. During this time, they host Carla's family at their home for Father's Day dinner. When the family leaves, they dismember the body with a circular saw, but that's just not enough. They think the best way to dispose of the evidence is by hiding the body in cement. So the next day, Paul bought a dozen bags of cement at a hardware store. Several trips were then made to Lake Gibson, 18 kilometers south of Port Dalhousie, to drop off the cement blocks. On the evening of June 29, 1991, a man and his wife were canoeing on Gibson Lake when they saw a block of cement while some pieces of meat were wrapped inside. Then, with the help of a fisherman, they pulled the cement block out, and upon closer inspection, inside the block was the calf and foot of a young woman. Soon the place was buzzing because they called the police. And the police found a total of 5 cement blocks dumped in shallow water. Police reasoned that whoever dumped this body in Gibson Lake was unfamiliar with the area, or he would have thrown the cement blocks under the bridge. The body was also identified as Leslie, who had been missing for days, as her distinctive braces provided a clue. On July 28, 1991, after Paul saw 21-year-old Sydney Kirshen while driving home from work, he followed her. He continued to follow her until August 9th. This time, she took evasive action, stopping at her boyfriend's house just before he arrived. Upon spotting Paul, the boyfriend gave chase, saw Paul's gold Nissan, and memorized the license plate. The couple identified the car as belonging to Paul to the Niagara Regional Police. An officer visited Paul's home and saw the car parked in the driveway, but did not pursue the matter or file an official police report. On the afternoon of April 16, 1992, Paul and Carla were still searching for potential victims. It was after school the day before Good Friday. Students were still heading home, but in general the streets were empty. As they passed Holy Cross High School, a major Catholic high school on the north end of the city, they noticed Kristen French, a 15-year-old student, walking down the street. The couple pulled into the parking lot of the nearby Grace Lutheran Church, and Carla got out of the car, map in hand, pretending to need help. While Kristen was concentrating on the map, Paul attacked from behind, brandishing a knife, and then pushed her into the front seat of their car, where Carla took control by pulling Kristen's hair from her back seat. Kristen would take the same route home every day, taking about 15 minutes to get home in order to satisfy her dog. When she didn't arrive home when she was supposed to, her parents became convinced she was in danger and immediately notified police. Within 24 hours, the Niagara Regional Police had assembled a team that searched the area along the route and located several witnesses who had witnessed the abduction from different sides, thus providing the police with a fairly clear picture. Over the course of 3 days over the Easter weekend, Paul and Carla videotaped themselves torturing Kristen and forcing her to drink copious amounts of alcohol to make her obey Paul's orders. And since Paul has long had it in his mind to try to kill her, and since she's never been blindfolded, and she remembers exactly what her kidnappers look like, Paul has no intention of letting her go from the start. The next day, the couple murdered Kristen before going to Easter dinner, when Paul strangled Kristen with an electric wire for a full 7 minutes before letting her die, while Carla watched on, and when Kristen resisted, Carla would beat her with a rubber mallet, and ultimately Kristen died as a result of their torture. On April 30th, 1992, Kristen's body was found in a ditch in Burlington, approximately 45 minutes from St. Her body had been cleaned and her hair had been cut off. The medical examiner found bruises on Kristen's back similar to the blunt force injuries on Leslie's body, and for the first time, police connected the two murders. Police then questioned Paul again on May 12th, based on clues about his propensity for violent and aggressive behavior, and considered him a prime suspect in both Southern Ontario murders. The Niagara Regional Police, in cooperation with the Halton Regional Police, formed a task force to investigate both crimes. On July 21st, a reenactment of Kristen's abduction was shown on television. It generated thousands of tips but no substantial leads. On January 6, 1993, Carla was admitted to St. Catherine's General Hospital after she had been severely beaten by Paul with a flashlight, whereupon Carla accused Paul of assaulting her with a weapon. The police then arrested Paul, but he was soon out on bail, and Carla never returned to her and Paul's home in Port Dalhousie. A month later, the Forensic Science Center finally matched Paul's DNA from 2 years earlier with Scarborough Rapist's DNA, and tests proved that Paul was Scarborough Rapist. After being notified, the police placed Paul under surveillance. Carla was initially uncooperative with the police, and after consulting with her lawyer, she said she would testify against Paul on the condition that she be granted immunity from prosecution. The Attorney General of Ontario did not agree to immunity, but was willing to consider a reduced sentence. On February 17th, Paul was arrested for the murders of Leslie and Kristen, as well as crimes committed by Scarborough Rapist. At first, the police interrogated Carla for 4 days. She blamed Paul for Tammy's death. She described how Paul abducted Leslie from the yard and how she and Paul lured Kristen to the car in the parking lot. She stated that both girls were used as slaves before Paul strangled them. It was also claimed that Paul had bragged to her about attacking at least 30 girls. Carla described herself as a battered wife who was forced to participate in Paul's crimes and lived in fear of him. When police searched their house, they found lists of Scarborough rapes, books of a perverted sexual nature, a hunting knife, handcuffs, and a videotape of Homolka and Bernardo engaging in sexual activity with 2 unidentified young women. So, in the eyes of the police, Carla was clearly a willing participant in both encounters. She admitted to the police that one of the girls had been drugged, and that she was later unaware that she had been assaulted. On July 6, 1993, as part of a plea bargain with prosecutors, Carla was convicted after pleading guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in the murders of Leslie and Kristen. She was sentenced to 2 12-year prison terms to be served immediately. On the news, Carla appeared as Paul, a co-conspirator, not a scared, forced participant. Jury selection for Paul's trial began on May 1, 1995. The Crown opened its case on May 18th. The trial lasted 4 months, during which time Carla spent 17 days on the witness stand in the courtroom. Paul was found guilty of all charges against him: 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, being held captive, and aggravated sexual assault, and 1 count of defilement of a human body. He was sentenced to life in prison and declared a dangerous offender with a high likelihood of parole. 5 years later, in 2000, both the Ontario Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada rejected Paul's efforts to appeal his murder conviction, and in 2006, Paul's lawyer indicated that his client had confessed to 10 other sexual assaults in 2005. He has been incarcerated at the Millhaven Maximum Security Prison in Bath, Ontario, since 2013. And while the government's investigation into Paul found that the police had made many mistakes and that competition between police agencies further compromised the investigation, some of Bernardo's crimes might have been prevented if his DNA samples had been processed and matched more quickly. Paul was treated differently by all inmates in prison because he was a serial rapist. For Paul's protection, he was kept in the segregation unit of the prison, but despite this, he was attacked and harassed. On one occasion in 1996, he was punched in the face by another inmate as he returned from a shower. In June 1999, 5 criminals attempted to break into the segregation perimeter where Paul was housed, and a riot squad had to use gas to disperse them. In 2006, Paul was interviewed in prison, stating that he was reformed and would be a good candidate for parole. But looking at the terms, he was ineligible for release in 2010 because he was convicted of multiple murders. He then had his last 2 parole hearings in 2021 as well as in February of this year, but was denied both. Carla Homolka, on the other hand, served her entire 12-year sentence before being released from prison in 2005 under a series of conditions imposed by a judge, including restrictions on her movements and a ban on contact with anyone under the age of 16. Just a few months later, another judge overturned those restrictions, which drew criticism from Leslie and the Kristen family. After her release, she moved to Montreal and has been married and has 3 children. Some reports indicated that she was volunteering at a private school, but this news caused resentment and concern among some parents when it broke in the media. Despite this, the school authorities stated that they were aware of Carla's past and that there were always other people present when she interacted with the children, ensuring that there was no chance of being alone.
Furthermore, Carla later moved with her family to the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe and lived under the name Leanne Bourdley, the brother of her prison lawyer. After being discovered by a Canadian journalist, she returned to Quebec. Despite the fact that she has been out of prison for many years, her past continues to generate a great deal of public interest and controversy.
In the history of New York City, there was a serial killer that was feared by all the women of New York City because the serial killer usually targeted attractive young women with long brown hair. And during the time that he terrorized the city, hundreds of young women cut their hair short and dyed it blonde, and thousands more stayed home at night, afraid to go out. It was on a Christmas Eve in 1975 that two women were attacked by the serial killer. One of them was named Michelle Foreman, only 15 years old, and the other woman had no precise identifying information. They both suffered the same thing when Michelle Foreman was walking down a quiet street, when suddenly a dark figure came running out of a dark corner with a hunting knife in his hand and stabbed her frantically with the knife. Luckily for Michelle Foreman, she survived, but her injuries were very serious. However, it took a long time for the NYPD to find a clue as well as a suspect, because at that time, the security in New York City was not good, and all kinds of stabbings happened from time to time, so the NYPD didn't think the case was that serious, but after a year, the situation escalated. Wendy Savino was shot on April 9th, 1976. Savino was sitting in her car resting when a man walked by her car smiling. Then, as she was getting ready to fasten her seatbelt, the man walked by again. Savino originally thought he was lost and tried to come over to ask for directions, but suddenly a gunshot rang out and Savino was shot in the chest. Savino then tried to raise her arms to protect herself, but the man immediately fired a second shot, which went through Savino's arm and ricocheted off the car's dashboard, punching her directly through her right eye. A third shot hit her shoulder, penetrated her windpipe, and ultimately stopped at her spine. Due to the severity of her injuries, Savino pretended she was dead, but the shooting didn't stop there. Two more shots struck Savino in the back, and the man fled in a hurry after he thought Savino was dead. But Savino didn't die. Her desire to survive was so strong that she kept crawling forward, crawling through a parking lot, and eventually collapsed in front of a restaurant. Luckily, the restaurant staff found her and rushed to call the police and emergency services. The NYPD then questioned Savino about the man's appearance and drew a sketch of the suspect, but after a long investigation, they did not get any valid results. 3 months later, on July 29th, a new shooting took place. 18-year-old Donna Loria and 19-year-old Jody Valenti were sitting in Valenti's car, chatting happily. Then, Donna tried to get out of the car, but a fierce-looking man suddenly appeared in the shadows. He took a gun out of his pocket and shot Loria. Jody, who heard the gunshot, was terrified and tried to run for her life, but the man fired mercilessly. Loria died on the spot, while Jody, who was shot in the leg, survived. By the time the police arrived at the scene, the man had long since fled, but they still gathered a number of useful clues. Loria's father said he saw a man who had been sitting in a yellow car, and the testimony of other people in the neighborhood indicated that the yellow car had been seen driving around in the early hours of the morning. The police also identified that the killer used a .44 caliber bulldog revolver. Although Jody survived, she was unable to identify the killer in detail. She only described him as a white man, probably in his 30s, with short, curly black hair. Beyond that, the police did not find any motive for the shooting and could only determine that it was an indiscriminate attack. 3 months later, on the night of October 23rd, 20-year-old Carl Denaro met college student Rosemary Keenan at a bar. The two left the venue just after 2:30 a.m. Carl wanted to give Rosemary a ride home, but as they were chatting, a man put his face close to the car window. Just as they were getting confused, the man pulled a gun. The bullet shattered the window and hit Carl in the head. A shocked Rosemary immediately started the car and drove away. It wasn't until they reached a street with many passersby that they realized they had been shot at. Despite Carl having a gunshot wound to the head, which required a metal plate to be fitted to his skull. Both survived. When the police found Carl, they identified the bullets as .44 caliber, but could not determine which gun they came from. Investigators also failed to connect this shooting to the previous one, as they occurred in two separate New York boroughs. Just 1 month later, on November 26, 1976, 16-year-old Donna DeMasi and 18-year-old Joanne Lomino were talking on the front porch of Joanne's house after watching a movie. The two girls saw a dark-haired man in a military uniform appear in the shadows. He began to ask them a question, but before he could finish, the man pulled out a gun and shot both victims. Despite being shot in the neck, Donna's injuries were not life-threatening. However, after that horrific accident, Joanne was shot in the back and paralyzed for life. The little information that the NYPD was able to determine about the case at the time was that the bullets came from an unknown .44 caliber firearm, and a sketch of the suspect was created and pieced together based on the girls' and neighborhood witnesses' statements. It's just after midnight on January 30th, 1977, and it's cold. John Deal and his girlfriend, Christine Freund, are sitting on a deserted street in Forest Hills, Queens, waiting for their car to warm up. They had just finished dinner, and John was looking forward to some partying. He leaned toward Christine, kissed her, and said, "We're going to the prom." She replied, "Okay, honey." John then tried to drive away and was starting the vehicle when a bullet shattered the window and hit Christine, who fell back against John without making a sound. John kept screaming Christine's name and then put his arm around her and put her in the seat. His hands were covered in Christine's blood. Then another shot was fired into the car and the bullet hit the dashboard. A scared John opened the car door, put his hands over his head, and ran while yelling, "My girlfriend is hurt." John didn't look back the entire time, and he didn't even know where the bullets were coming from. Even though the police arrived at the scene quickly, Christine Freund died 4 hours later due to unsuccessful attempts to save her life, as she was hit in the head by a bullet. It was this shooting that first led the NYPD to begin connecting the dots between several previous shootings. They observed that all the shootings involved a .44 caliber gun, and the killer seemed to be targeting young women with long, dark hair. On March 8, 1977, Virginia Voss Grishian, a student at Columbia University, was shot and killed on her way home from school. She lived just 1 block from another victim, Christine Freund. Virginia Voss Grishian was shot several times and eventually died from a gunshot wound to the head. Within minutes of the shooting, a neighbor who heard gunshots stepped outside and saw a short teenage boy darting away from the crime scene. Other neighbors also reported seeing the teen and a man matching the description at the scene of the shooting. The earliest media reports had implied that the teenager was the killer. Eventually, after an investigation, police determined that the teenager was a witness, not a suspect. Subsequently, the NYPD confirmed that this was a serial killing and held a press conference. In April 1977, in the Bronx, just a few blocks from the site of the first shooting, Alexandria Isso and Valentina Suriani were sitting in their car talking when they were both shot twice. Valentina was pronounced dead at the scene, and Alexandria died a few hours later in the hospital. Until her death, Alexandria was unable to describe the appearance of their attacker. But it was during this murder that the killer left a note at the crime scene for the first time, signed Son of Sam. In the letter, he described himself as a monster. "Papa Sam also locked me in the attic," he wrote. "I can't get out, but I look out the attic window and watch the world. I feel like an outsider. I'm on a different wavelength than everyone else. I'm set up to kill and to stop me. You'll have to kill me." Using the information in this first letter and the connections between the earlier shootings, police investigators began profiling the suspect. They described him as neurotic, possibly suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and believing he was possessed by the devil. In an attempt to track down the real culprit, the NYPD employed various methods. They tracked down every legal owner of a .44 caliber Bulldog revolver in New York City, interrogated those people, and conducted forensic tests. However, they were unable to determine which gun had been used in the murders. The NYPD even set up traps with undercover officers posing as couples in parked cars to lure the snake out of its hole, but these efforts proved fruitless. On May 30th, 1977, New York Daily News columnist Jimmy Breslin received a letter. On the reverse side of the envelope was written, "Blood and Family, Darkness and Death, Absolute Depravity, 44." In the letter, Son of Sam claimed to be a loyal reader of Breslin's columns and mentioned several past victims. He went on to ridicule the incompetence of the New York City Police Department, which had been unable to solve the case. "You can't forget Donna Loria, and you can't let people forget her. She was a very, very sweet girl, but Sam is a thirsty lad, and he won't let me stop killing until he's had enough blood," the letter read. "Please inform all the police officers in charge of this case that I wish them luck. Tell them to keep digging, keep going, think positively, and cheer up. When I am arrested, I promise to buy new shoes for all the men on the case if I can raise the money," the letter continued. Son of Sam also asked, "How much money will you have on July 29?" Investigators took this as a warning, as July 29th would be the anniversary of the first shooting. One notable detail is that this letter appeared more sophisticated than the first, leading investigators to believe it may have been written by a copycat. The letter was eventually published in the New York Daily News, and Breslin also urged the killer to turn himself in to the police. The entire city of New York was thrown into a state of panic. Due to Son of Sam's predilection for attacking women with long brown hair, many women in New York at the time began changing their hairstyles. But Son of Sam didn't stop his killing, and on June 26, 1977, nearly a month after Son of Sam sent his first letter to the press, he resurfaced in Bayside, Queens, New York. He targeted Sal Lupo and Judy Pacito, who were again talking in a car. He fired 3 shots into the vehicle. Sal was shot in the arm, and Judy was hit in the head, shoulder, and neck. Despite their injuries, both victims survived, but the assailant was not seen. However, witnesses in the neighborhood reported seeing a tall, short, stocky man with dark hair fleeing the scene and a blond man with a mustache driving in the area. The NYPD believed that the dark-haired man was the suspect, while the blond man was considered a possible witness. Despite increased police patrols in areas where the killer had previously been active, by July 1977, Son of Sam had changed his location and was preparing for a final attack. A couple, Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante, were sitting in their car kissing when Son of Sam suddenly appeared and fired 4 shots into the car. Both were shot in the head. Robert lost an eye, and Stacy died from her injuries. Unlike most of the other female victims, Stacy did not have long or dark hair. There were several witnesses to the shooting who were able to give the police a description of the shooter. One witness said the man looked as if he was wearing a wig, which might explain the various accounts of blonde and dark-haired suspects. Some witnesses saw a man at the scene wearing a wig, driving a yellow car without headlights on, quickly fleeing the crime scene. The police decided to investigate all owners of yellow cars matching the description. Berkowitz's car was one of them, but investigators initially identified him only as a witness, not a suspect. On August 10, 1977, police searched Berkowitz's car. Inside, they found a rifle, a duffel bag full of ammunition, maps of the crime scene, and an unsent Son of Sam letter. The police decided to wait for Berkowitz to leave his apartment, hoping to have enough time to obtain a search warrant, since they had searched his car without one. When Berkowitz left his apartment, the police surrounded him, finding him holding a paper bag containing a bulldog revolver. When Berkowitz was arrested, the first thing he said to the police was, "Well, you got me. What took you so long?" When police searched Berkowitz's apartment, they found sinister graffiti painted on the walls, as well as diaries documenting his 1,400 acts of arson in the New York area. When Berkowitz was taken in for questioning, he quickly admitted to the shootings and said he would plead guilty. 3 medical professionals examined Berkowitz and found him criminally competent. In May 1978, Berkowitz pleaded guilty to all the shootings. He was ultimately sentenced to 365 years in prison to be served at the Attica Correctional Facility Supermax in New York. In February 1979, Berkowitz revealed at a press conference that his earlier claims of demonic possession were false. He later stated to a court-appointed psychiatrist that he felt the world had failed him and that he wanted to pay the world back in kind. Richard David Falco was born on June 1st, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. His biological parents were Betty Falco and Joseph Kleinman. When Betty became pregnant, Kleinman threatened to abandon her if she kept the baby, as they were not married. As a result, when Richard was born, his birth parents gave him up for adoption. When he was about a week old, he was adopted by a couple named Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, who were Jewish-American hardware store retailers. They changed his name from Richard David Falco to David Richard Berkowitz. From a young age, Berkowitz began to exhibit early signs of what would become a pattern of violent behavior. Despite having above-average intelligence, he was hyperactive and irritable. He lost interest in school early on and became obsessed with petty theft, bullying, and arson. However, his misbehavior never led to legal trouble or negatively impacted his school record. On October 5th, 1967, Berkowitz's adoptive mother died of breast cancer. Afterward, his adoptive father remarried, creating a tense family situation, especially since Berkowitz did not get along with his new adoptive mother. His adoptive father and stepmother eventually grew weary of Berkowitz's emotional problems and moved to Florida. Left behind, Berkowitz's behavior deteriorated further. His grades fell, his religious beliefs wavered, and he became the target of bullying for being overweight, leading him to become increasingly antisocial. As he grew older, Berkowitz lamented his lack of a social life and his inability to find a girlfriend. "I believe that sex was the answer, a path to happiness," he once said. He felt that he had been unfairly deprived of what he saw as the key to happiness. Pathological thoughts about death and adoption also plague Berkowitz. Berkowitz originally thought that his adoptive parents were his biological parents, but his adoptive parents told him that his biological mother died in childbirth, and so Berkowitz grew up with a sense of responsibility and guilt for his biological mother's death. He also has disturbing and conflicting thoughts about his biological father, and Berkowitz specifically wonders why his father abandoned him after his mother's death. Berkowitz thinks that maybe his biological father gave him away to someone else because his father thought that he was the cause of his mother's death, and so he hated him. After experiencing great ups and downs in his life, Berkowitz became very withdrawn and lonely and wanted to find a sense of purpose and meaning in his life. So in 1971, he graduated from high school and enlisted in the military. After serving in the military in 1974, Berkowitz returned to New York City, where he dated a prostitute and developed a sexually transmitted disease, his first and last romantic relationship. Berkowitz then moved into a small apartment in Yonkers, New York, where he was alone and still dealing with emotions related to his adoption and the death of his adoptive mother. He became depressed, lonely, and above all, angry. Berkowitz then became obsessed with determining his roots. He wanted to find his birth parents. After an exhaustive search of public records, Berkowitz was thrilled to discover that his biological mother, Betty Falco, was still alive. However, when Berkowitz meets Betty, she acts distant as well as disinterested in Berkowitz, but she still reveals why she abandoned him back then. When Berkowitz hears these words, he breaks down to the point where he doesn't hear the news that his own father is dead. Eventually, he chose never to contact his biological mother, Betty, again because of his overwhelming disappointment. In 1974, he returned to New York and worked as a security guard, and it wasn't long before he became obsessed with Satan and the occult. By 1975, the isolation, fantasizing, and paranoid schizophrenia had progressed to the point where Berkowitz lost touch with reality. Feeling cut off from the world around him, he became an arsonist and set hundreds of fires in New York City without being arrested. As time passed and his disillusionment grew worse, he began to listen to the voices of demons who constantly compelled him to kill. In January 1976, Berkowitz moved into a two-family house in Yonkers, a suburb of New York. Berkowitz believed that the German shepherd that lived in the house and the other neighbors' dogs were possessed by demons who commanded him to kill beautiful young women. During this time, a dog in the neighborhood was shot and killed. possibly by Berkowitz, who also began to view his neighbors as demons. In April 1976, Berkowitz moved into an apartment in Yonkers, but his new neighbors also had dogs. His neighbor, retired Sam Carr, had a black Labrador retriever named Harvey. Berkowitz believed that the retriever was begging him to kill it, and he also believed that Sam Carr was a powerful demon, so in subsequent letters, he referred to himself as Sam's son, a reference to his neighbor, Sam Carr. It was after this that Berkowitz began his career as a serial killer. What follows is what happened after Berkowitz's arrest. In 1979, an inmate at the Attica Correctional Facility slit Berkowitz's throat, and he almost died in prison. In 1987, Berkowitz said he found God and became a Christian, calling himself a son of hope, and religion became part of his prison routine. In 1996, the police reopened Berkowitz's case to investigate some of his allegations, but the investigation was suspended due to the lack of significant findings, but remained open. In 2002, after Berkowitz had served 25 years of his sentence, he became eligible for parole, and parole hearings about him are held every 2 years. In fact, Berkowitz has applied for parole several times, but he has been denied. The most recent parole hearing is scheduled for May 14th, 2024, which is in May of this year. But his parole application continues to be denied, making this the 12th time his parole application has been denied. Interestingly, there was another law enacted for Berkowitz, the Son of Sam law. There was a media frenzy even before Berkowitz's arrest, with rumors of people willing to pay high prices for Berkowitz's stories, and some throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars at the killer's pen for exclusives. After his arrest, Berkowitz literally received tens of thousands of dollars from publishers for the rights to his stories. Then in New York State, there were senators who were outraged that murderers were getting rich from their crimes and introduced an amendment to the bill requiring that money obtained by criminals as a result of their crimes be paid to the Crime Victims Compensation Board for distribution to the victims of those crimes. The legislature acted swiftly, and the Son of Sam law emerged, which requires any entity, including book publishers, filmmakers, playwrights, etc., that contracts with a convicted criminal to describe his or her crime in detail to disgorge any profits made from that creation. As a matter of procedure, the state pays this money to the victims who file civil suits against the criminals. After New York, a number of states went on to enact their own versions of Son of Sam laws to prevent criminals from profiting from their wrongdoing. In a bill passed by the U.S. Congress in 1984, those convicted of federal crimes were also prohibited from profiting from their victims. Any convicted criminals who sold their stories forfeited their profits, which were to be deposited into a fund for victims. Berkowitz's psychological problems are an issue worth examining, and abandonment by his biological parents is a significant source of his psychological problems. Abandoned from birth, he grew up with a constant sense of insecurity and belonging, with serious doubts about his self-worth and a feeling of being unloved and unwanted. The death of his adoptive mother further exacerbated his inner loneliness. The loss of his adoptive mother, who may have been an important emotional pillar in his life, deprived Berkowitz of this dependence, while the family tensions brought about by his adoptive father's remarriage, and especially the uneasy relationship with his new adoptive mother, added to his stress. Growing up, Berkowitz exhibited a disinterest in learning as well as hyperactive and irritable behavior at school, which led to isolation from his peers and difficulties in establishing normal social relationships. Delinquent behaviors such as petty theft and bullying of his peers were outward manifestations of his internal dissatisfaction, but further deteriorated his relationships with others. As he grew older, he was deeply distressed by his lack of social life and his inability to get a girlfriend. Viewing sex as a path to happiness reflected his extreme desire for emotion and intimacy. However, the unfulfillment of this longing caused him to feel socially ostracized, creating a strong sense of injustice and frustration. Overall, Berkowitz's psyche was the result of a combination of childhood trauma, social frustration, identity confusion, and schizophrenia, which ultimately led to his serial killing behavior. A young man jumped out of a second-story window of a house on a quiet night. This is what really happened in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Kansas City on April 2nd, 1988, which happened to be the day before Easter. The young man, Christopher Bryson, jumped from the second floor with his heart pounding like, and then quickly ran to the door of a home, banging on it repeatedly. A few minutes later, the homeowner, who had been awakened, he opened the door and saw a very distressed Bryson, who was almost naked and had something like a dog collar around his neck. The homeowner realized that this was likely a special event and quickly called the police. During the time he waited for the police to arrive, Christopher Bryson told the horrific story of what he had experienced in that house. Bryson was only 22 years old, and he was one of the rare males who worked in a particular profession, often going to bus stops and bars to get some customers in order to support his family. 5 days before Easter, Bryson met a customer near the old Greyhound bus station in downtown Kansas City named Robert Berdella, the owner of the house. At the time, Berdella suggested that they go to his house, which would make for a more moody atmosphere. And Bryson was pleased with the idea because he was used to staying in cheap motel rooms in the back seats of automobiles, but going to the house would make the transaction more interesting. Bryson spent some time at Berdella's house, and they had a romantic candlelight dinner, a time where they got to know each other, when Bryson just thought he had met a great customer. After dinner, Berdella suggests that they go upstairs. Bryson is puzzled, and Berdella explains that they are on the first floor, where there are two very aggressive dogs, and upstairs, where the room has a fancy television and comfortable furniture. On the way up the stairs, Bryson walks in front of Berdella, mumbling something about wanting to see the decorations on the second floor in a hurry. However, he does not realize that Berdella is behind him with a hammer in her hand, and as Berdella raises the hammer and keeps hitting Bryson on the back of the head, Bryson falls to the ground, and as he falls into unconsciousness, Berdella takes a Polaroid and hits Bryson on the back of the head. While he was in a coma, Berdella continued to photograph Bryson with a Polaroid camera. Over the next 4 days, Bryson was subjected to many different types of torture by Berdella, who beat Bryson with a crowbar and injected animal tranquilizers and antibiotics into various parts of his body. Berdella immobilized different parts of Bryson's body with clamps, tortured Bryson in a variety of brutal ways, and threatened Bryson by saying, "I had several men before you, but they didn't cooperate, so I killed them and had the two vicious dogs eat them." Bryson heard these words and cooperated with Berdella in order to survive because he believed that everything Berdella said was true. During the first few days of Bryson's control, if Bryson yelled, Berdella poked a syringe into his throat and threatened to make him lose his voice completely if he continued to yell. And Berdella even stabbed him in the eye with a cotton swab that was coated with a chemical such as gasoline or detergent. At the time, Bryson thought he would never see his family again, but he never gave up hope of escaping. On the very night that Bryson decided to escape, he made a lot of effort. Bryson had been cooperative with Berdella's behavior and was allowed to hold the remote control for the television, though his hands were still tied with rope. Earlier that day, Bryson had been given a cigarette for his cooperation, and Berdella had placed the matches next to the bed. At first, Bryson wasn't sure if Berdella was at home, so he used the remote control to lower the volume of the television to test if Berdella was there. If Berdella had been home, he would have warned Bryson. Fortunately, the test indicated that Berdella was not at home. Bryson then began to work on his escape. He first untied one hand from the rope and then burned the rest of the rope with a match. However, with two vicious dogs downstairs, Bryson realized he had no other option but to jump from the second floor. Although he hurt his foot upon landing, it did not hinder his ability to escape. Ignoring the pain, he ran down the street to find the nearest house. After Bryson recounted his ordeal, the police arrived and some of the surrounding neighbors came to see what had happened. After Bryson recounted his ordeal, many people refused to believe that Berdella had held Bryson captive, believing that Bryson had framed Berdella. Because in their eyes, Berdella is a very good person. He participated in many charity organizations specializing in finding jobs for young men or providing shelter for men who have no place to live. And in addition to charity activities, Berdella also participated in organizing the community's security work, specializing in catching undesirable youths. So in their eyes, Berdella is a very trustworthy person. However, the police would not change their goal just because of some words. Especially when they saw the dense bruises on Bryson's body, they had every reason to believe Bryson's words. Therefore, when Bryson was sent to the nearby hospital to receive medical treatment, the police still waited for Berdella to come back home at the same place. When Berdella came home and saw the police, he seemed surprised, except that he was still under arrest. But Berdella refused to allow the police to search his home because they did not have a warrant. And according to the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be infringed. This means that generally, police searches require obtaining a warrant issued by a judge. But the police were prepared for this, and because of Bryson's injuries, they had already obtained a search warrant. When the police attempted to enter Berdella's house, they were greeted by the two very aggressive dogs that Berdella owned and waited until Animal Services had safely removed the dogs before entering the house. When several officers entered the house, it was littered with boxes, magazines, clothes, and some strange objects, and the floor was littered with untreated dog feces. After the officers cautiously made their way up to the second floor, they were stunned when, in the second floor bedroom, they found evidence that corroborated Bryson's report, a blood-stained bed with burnt rope on it. Next to the bed was a metal pole, a tray of hypodermic needles, swabs, and droppers. On the floor nearby was an electrical transformer with clamps on the end of the wires. But that's not all they found. After testing, the house showed large amounts of blood in all corners, especially in the basement and bathtub. As Bryson said, there were more than 350 Polaroids showing young men in various stages of torture, some of whom appeared to be dead. Among all the disorganized clutter, they also found 2 human skulls, an envelope full of human teeth, and what looked like human vertebrae. Forensic anthropologists analyzed the skulls. One was a high-quality replica, but the other was very real and belonged to a young man who had died about a year earlier. Dental records showed that the skull belonged to Robert Sheldon, a poor victim. In fact, police also found a hacksaw, miter saw, and chainsaw in the house, especially the chainsaw with blood, tissue, and human hair. In the backyard, they found another human skull and a small bone fragment, which was later identified as Larry Pearson's. Most distressingly, on the dresser, they found a book written by Berdella. In it, he detailed the gruesome accounts of each victim. As a result, the Kansas City Police Department formed a task force to dig into Berdella's past and try to identify the people shown in the photographs. Many of them corresponded to people who had disappeared since 1984. On July 22, 1988, Berdella was charged with the murder of Larry Wayne Pearson. The following month, in the prosecution for the murder of Robert Sheldon, Berdella pleaded guilty. However, he was not sentenced to death because his attorney arranged a plea bargain in exchange for his confession. Berdella also confessed to murdering a total of 6 men, all between the ages of 18 and 21, beginning in 1984. In each case, the details of how he seduced them and the exact methods of torture he used were different. But the overall modus operandi was the same. Once they were inside his house, he either drugged them or knocked them out and tied them up. Over the course of hours or days, he would torture them repeatedly, just as he had done with Bryson. Some of them died as a result of his torture, and some he suffocated with plastic bags or sticks. Once his victim died, he would throw away the body with other garbage. Berdella was then sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and while incarcerated, he railed against the media for dehumanizing him, saying that he was really a good man, and he filed several lawsuits against the prison for abuse. In the fall of 1992, Berdella wrote a letter to a priest who was his friend, claiming that prison officials had denied him heart medication. Then, On October 8, 1992, Berdella, 43, died of a heart attack at the state prison in Jefferson City, Missouri. Until after Berdella's death, however, there were still many people who wondered why Berdella did what he did, and some media outlets dug deeper into Berdella's life in order to report on the case in more detail. On January 31st, 1949, Berdella was born in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, a quiet suburb of Cleveland, much like the neighborhood where he would later live. Berdella was raised in a devout Roman Catholic household by his father, a dye blender for the Ford Motor Company who regularly beat him with a belt, and his mother a homemaker. From an early age, Berdella was a loner, and because of his severe nearsightedness, high blood pressure, and speech impediment, he was an easy target for bullies, including his father, who would physically and verbally abuse Berdella because of his lack of athletic ability. Berdella's life began to deteriorate when he reached the age of 16, and his father died of a heart attack at the age of 39. Shortly after, his mother remarried, which left Berdella angry and resentful, and it was during this time that he was assaulted by a male coworker at the restaurant where he worked. Being a loner, he read the 1965 adaptation of John Fowles's book, The Collector, about a man who kidnaps a young woman and holds her captive in his basement, which planted a seed in Berdella's mind. Robert Berdella graduated from high school in 1967 and began attending the Kansas City Art Institute, where he was finally able to express himself and come out as gay, having originally wanted to become a professor, but ultimately choosing to become a chef. While at the Art Institute, he was involved in animal mistreatment on at least 3 occasions, 2 of which were with a duck and a chicken, and the third was experimenting with tranquilizers and sleeping pills on a dog. He also embarked on a criminal career, abusing alcohol and selling drugs. At the age of 19, he was arrested for possession of LSD and marijuana, but was released after only 5 days due to lack of evidence. In 1969, he dropped out of school and became a full-time successful chef. As a member of the local Chefs Association, he helped establish a training program for aspiring chefs and was a member of the local crime prevention and neighborhood watch associations. At the age of 32, he quit his job as a chef and opened his own store selling a variety of oddities and antiques. After he came out publicly, he had a brief affair with a Vietnam veteran that didn't last. Instead, he began dating men in specialized professions, befriending them, and even trying to help them out of their bad lives. Then in 1984, Berdella found his first victim, Jerry Howell. Jerry was the 19-year-old son of Paul Howell, one of Berdella's acquaintances in the art dealing business. On July 5th of that year, Berdella offered to drive Jerry to a dance competition in a neighboring town. On the way, Berdella intoxicated Jerry with alcohol and drugged him unconscious. He then strapped Jerry to his bed for 28 hours, during which time he repeatedly tortured Jerry, who could only make desperate pleas, but Berdella was unmoved and continued to torture Jerry until Jerry eventually suffocated from his own vomit. After Jerry's death, Berdella put his body in a separate garbage bag with other kinds of garbage and put them on the roadside for the garbage worker to take away. Berdella's next victim was one of the homeless men he had cared for and exploited over the years, Robert Sheldon. On April 10, 1985, the 23-year-old man arrived at Berdella's doorstep and pleaded with Berdella to let him stay there. Although Berdella was not attracted to Sheldon, he still tormented Sheldon, and starting with Sheldon, Berdella began experimenting with chemicals to torture his victims. He tied piano wire around Sheldon's wrists in an attempt to permanently damage the nerves there, put drain cleaner in his eyes, caulked his ears, and placed needles under Sheldon's fingernails. The following June, Berdella discovered Mark Wallace trying to sleep in his shed, so Berdella drugged Wallace, subjected him to high-voltage electric shocks, and inserted hypodermic needles into his back. Wallace died after several days of relentless torture, and his body was disposed of. The next month, Berdella was contacted by another acquaintance, a man named Walter James Ferris, who wanted to stay at his house. When Ferris arrived, Berdella tied him to his bed and shocked him with 700 volts of electricity, torturing him for 2 days until he died. The following year, Berdella met Todd Stoops, a male with a specialty occupation who had previously lived with Berdella at a nearby park. After Berdella took Stoops back to his house for lunch, Stoops was kidnapped. There, Berdella drugged Stoops and kept him in the house for several weeks, where he attempted to turn Stoops into a slave, tried to disable his vision by electrocuting his eyes, and unsuccessfully attempted to silence him by injecting a cleaning agent into his throat. Stoops eventually died of blood loss. In 1987, Berdella continued to date 20-year-old Larry Wayne Pearson, whom Berdella had met while working at the store. During the date, after Pearson jokingly mentioned his practice of robbing gay men in Wichita, Berdella decided to kill him. He drugged Pearson and continued his cruel punishment by breaking one of Pearson's hands with a metal bar. After 6 weeks of torture, Pearson eventually died. On March 29, 1988, Berdella kidnapped his last victim, Christopher Bryson, and his life of crime came to an end. Discussing Robert Berdella's psychological state is a complex and worthwhile endeavor. In terms of childhood experiences, Berdella was raised in a devoutly Catholic household, where his father's harsh physical punishment, as well as verbal abuse, left Berdella in a state of perpetual fear and depression. Severe myopia, high blood pressure, and a speech impediment in turn made Berdella a target of bullying, which would undoubtedly have a significant negative impact on Berdella's self-esteem and self-perception. The early death of his father and the remarriage of his mother further exacerbated internalized anger and resentment, and these early traumas may have led Berdella to develop a distorted perception of the world. The experience of being assaulted by a male coworker at a restaurant may have created a great deal of distrust in human relationships and may have even triggered a deep-seated desire for revenge in Berdella. Berdella's involvement in the improper treatment of animals during art school and the beginning of his criminal career suggests that Berdella may have vented his inner pain and anger through these actions, and it also reflects Berdella's disregard for life. The book, The Collector, planted the seeds of crime in Berdella's mind, suggesting that Berdella may have found in the book a way to echo his own deepest desires. Berdella began to put his desires into practice by kidnapping and torturing young men in order to satisfy his desire for control and power. Berdella's involvement with men in particular professions may be partly out of necessity, but it may also be that Berdella is looking for a way to control and dominate others. Berdella tried to help them out of their bad lives, perhaps to find a sense of self-worth in them, but this help eventually devolved into brutal exploitation and torture. During the course of his crimes, Berdella kept detailed records of his victims' misery, which suggests that Berdella had a perverse sense of satisfaction and fulfillment with his actions. Berdella lashed out at the media for dehumanizing him while he was incarcerated and filed a lawsuit against the prison for cruelty, suggesting that Berdella may have lacked a sense of self-control over his actions. Berdella may have lacked true awareness and remorse for his actions, and continued to attempt to defend his image and rights. Overall, Berdella's psychological state is the result of a combination of factors, including childhood trauma, adverse experiences, psychological distortions, and a desire for power and control. Exploring Berdella's psychological state can help us better understand the causes of criminal behavior and how to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. People often say that the law is the most powerful weapon against criminals. However, in history, there was a serial killer who, under the protection of the law, cruelly took the lives of dozens of young girls. The victims' families mournfully called for him a severe or long-term sentence, but because the highest penalty in that country was only 16 years, the killer was ultimately sentenced to just 16 years in prison. In other words, for each innocent life he took, his sentence was extended by only 2 months. On an evening in May 1985, the police station in Guayaquil Port, the capital of Guayas province in Ecuador, received a report from a woman who said her daughter was missing. Her name was Ana, and her missing daughter was named Marta. Since her husband had passed away, Ana had been struggling to raise her children by selling fruit at the market. The police chief, Edward Gonzalez, sympathized with this hardworking woman and personally took her detailed statement. Anna said, "In the morning, Marta was helping me pack bags for customers. When there were fewer customers, she went with some friends to play at a nearby flower shop. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after a few hours, I couldn't find her anywhere. I asked her friends, but they said they hadn't seen her." Anna recounted the events of the disappearance in fragments, but since Marta had been missing for less than 24 hours and it was nearing the end of the workday, Edward didn't know what to do. If the girl wasn't actually missing, it would only add unnecessary burden. Seeing Edward's silence and frown, the distressed Anna guessed he might not want to help and broke down in tears. Reluctantly, Edward agreed to help. He said they could first check the market, and then he and Anna left the police station together. Half an hour later, they walked to the market, where a group of ragged children were selling pens, cigarettes, lighting, and lighters to passers-by. Anna took Edward to a short, plump Indian woman with black hair, who was the owner of the flower shop where Marta was last seen playing. The shop owner told Edward that around 10 a.m., Marta was indeed playing with her 2 children in the shop, but as many customers came in, she didn't pay much attention to Marta's whereabouts. After hearing this, Edward spoke with nearby children, who said the last time they saw Marta, she was talking to a man selling pencils, who was about 5 feet tall with light brown skin and black hair. Since they were busy playing hide and seek, they didn't continue watching Marta, and she disappeared from view at that time. Edward wondered if Marta might have fallen asleep after hiding for too long while playing hide and seek. He reassured the anxious Anna, though he had a growing sense of unease because prior to Marta's disappearance, several girls in the area had already gone missing. However, behind all of this was a boy's life shaped by his parents' neglect and unfair treatment. Daniel Camargo Barboza was born on January 22, 1930, into a wealthy family in the town of Anolaima in the Colombian Andes. His father, Daniel Camargo Briceño, was a businessman, and his mother, Teresa Barboza, was his father's second wife. Camargo had a half-sister from his father's first marriage. When Camargo was 2 years old, his mother passed away, and his father soon remarried. Camargo was very intelligent and performed excellently at school, with an IQ rated at 116. However, whenever Camargo tried to connect with his father, regardless of the topic, his father would tell him that he was worthless and a hopeless case. Eventually, Camargo lost interest in communicating with his father. Due to his father's emotional distance and greater interest in business than in family, Camargo's childhood was mainly influenced by his stepmother, Dioselina Fernandez. Fernandez, who married at a young age, was obsessed with having a daughter. When she discovered she was unable to have children, her obsession grew stronger. She doted on her stepdaughter while treating her stepson unfairly. Fernandez would punish Camargo by taking away his pants, forcing him to wear girls' clothing, and inviting his schoolmates to watch him in these clothes. These punishments destroyed his social standing at school, making him a target for bullying. From then on, Camargo developed a deep hatred for women and anything associated with femininity. Returning to Marta's disappearance, Edward may have still harbored some hope, as there had never been severe violent incidents in the area before. However, his concerns soon became reality when one of the most horrifying and brutal serial murder cases in Ecuador's history began to unfold, casting a pervasive and indescribable fear over the small, otherwise obscure South American town for years to come. After returning home, Anna did not find her daughter. Over the next 3 weeks, Edward's small police station received reports of 2 more missing girls, aged 8 and 9, with their disappearances also occurring near the same market. Even more bizarrely, starting from the day after Anna's report, the police organized patrols around the market and interviewed dozens of shop owners, indicating that these girls disappeared under police surveillance. The situation became even more alarming with a new report. A middle-aged man called in to report that he had discovered the body of a girl by the roadside. This suggested that the missing girls might have been murdered. A middle-aged man called in, trembling as he reported that he and a few friends, after finishing a vacation in Playas County and heading home, had their car break down 2 miles south of Guayaquil. As he attempted to open the hood of the car, he noticed something bulging and round in the roadside ditch. Initially thinking it was discarded rags, he realized upon closer inspection that it was the body of a girl. Upon hearing this, Edward called the coroner and arranged for an ambulance and a tow truck. By 5 p.m., the police arrived at the scene, set up a perimeter, and after making some adjustments, Edward led the way past the barrier to investigate. As Edward approached the body, he noticed that the head was completely destroyed. Minutes later, the coroner arrived and, after an initial examination, determined that the girl had been dead for over 2 weeks. Based on the dirt on the clothes and bite marks on the body, it appeared she had been dug up from a shallow grave by wild dogs. After transporting the body to the morgue, the coroner told Edward, "I have been a forensic pathologist for 15 years, and this case is the most shocking I have encountered. I cannot imagine the level of hatred required to commit such a brutal act. This is the most savage individual I have ever encountered." In the early 1940s, Briceño sent Camargo to a prestigious all-boys Catholic boarding school. Camargo excelled academically once again, but his plans for further education were interrupted due to financial difficulties faced by the family during a period of violence. Forced to drop out, Camargo took a job as a door-to-door salesman. In 1957, he began a relationship with a young client, Alcira Castillo, and after a few dates, persuaded her to rent an apartment together. However, the cost of dating was higher than he anticipated, leading him to attempt to rob another client's store on May 24, 1958, to make ends meet. He was arrested just hours later and sent to a low-security prison for petty theft. The prison's security was lax, allowing Camargo to simply take a writing board from a desk, pretend to be busy, and walk out with the changing guards, continuing his life as if nothing had happened. In 1962, Camargo met another woman, Esperanza, and fell in love with her to the extent that he decided to leave Castillo despite having 2 children with her. After becoming engaged to Esperanza, he discovered she was not a virgin and later found her in bed with another man. Returning to Marta's disappearance, the police conducted a thorough search around the site where the girl's body was discovered, but unfortunately found little evidence. They did recover a crumpled candy wrapper from a bush less than 2 meters from the grave, which they suspected might have been left by the perpetrator, and carefully placed it in a plastic bag to take back to the station. The next morning, several parents of missing children received calls from the police to come and identify the body. When Anna saw the blue dress, she broke down in hysterical tears, recognizing it as the dress her daughter had been wearing when she disappeared. That afternoon, Edward contacted the police in Quito, the capital, to check if any criminals had escaped from prison. He also had the photos of the missing girls published in newspapers in Guayaquil, Quito, Esmeraldas, and other major Ecuadorian cities, hoping to gather more information. Soon, Captain Pablo Andrade from the Quito Police Department returned the call, reporting that 3 months prior, a 10-year-old girl had mysteriously disappeared in their jurisdiction. Her body was only found 2 weeks ago in a shallow grave. She had been assaulted and killed with a large knife, and the perpetrator was still at large with no witnesses. The girl had been an orphan from an orphanage in Ambato, selling lottery tickets at the weekly Indian markets in Quito to make a few sucres. The similarities in the method of operation, but the wide geographic distance between the crime scenes alarmed the Ecuadorian police. If it was indeed the same perpetrator, they were dealing with someone whose identity was unknown and potentially untraceable, making it even more challenging to pinpoint the suspect and predict their next move. Due to Camargo's strong psychological issues, when he discovered that Esperanza was not a virgin, he initially wanted to end the engagement. However, he found himself unable to do so. Instead, Camargo used his manipulative skills to convince Esperanza to make amends by providing him with a virgin, so he could take her place in taking their virginity. After Esperanza agreed, she brought 5 young girls to their apartment and drugged them to make them unconscious, allowing Camargo to harm them while they were in a state of unconsciousness. This continued until 1964, when their 5th victim became aware of what was happening and recognized them. leading to their arrest. Camargo was initially sentenced to 3 years in prison, but another judge increased the sentence to 8 years. Camargo, feeling like a victim himself, resolved that the next time he assaulted a girl, he would also kill her. After serving his sentence, he was released and moved to Brazil. However, in 1973, he was arrested for illegal immigration and deported back to Colombia. In Colombia, Camargo began working as a street vendor, selling televisions and monitors. On May 2, 1974, Camargo, walking in front of a school in Barranquilla, saw a 9-year-old girl he found attractive. He lured her to a secluded spot, strangled her, and left her body along with a television he was transporting. The next day, Camargo returned to handle the body and retrieve the television, but was caught by a suspicious officer who had been tracking him. He was convicted and sentenced to 30 years of isolation on Gorgona Island, located 35 kilometers off Colombia's Pacific coast. After 10 years of imprisonment, Camargo accidentally discovered a kayak on the beach. He immediately jumped in and paddled continuously until he reached the mainland several hours later. The prison reported him as a fugitive, but authorities believed he had died at sea, thinking that an inexperienced person could not navigate such dangerous waters. The media even reported stories of Camargo being eaten by sharks. In reality, Camargo had studied ocean currents, read navigation books, and learned precise positioning in the years before his escape. Once on shore, he headed south towards the Ecuadorian border, marking the beginning of Ecuador's nightmare. In the following 2 months, Edward was unable to obtain any information about the perpetrator. By October 1985, the situation had worsened, with more and more girls mysteriously disappearing, and local residents discovering additional bodies. The bodies of girls were found in various locations: a garbage bin on Santay Island, a farm in Taura, a pile of trash on the outskirts of Guayaquil, a sewage ditch in Azogues, buried in desolate fields in a small village in Riobamba, on a riverbank in Suscal, and on a roadside in Bouquet. There was no doubt that these girls had been harmed, many having been tortured to death. Each discovery was a torment for the Ecuadorian police. To better understand the perpetrator, Edward consulted a local psychologist. The psychologist speculated that the killer was mentally disturbed, but likely intelligent and cautious. Such individuals often have a history of abuse or neglect before the age of 5, which fosters deep-seated hatred that manifests in extreme violence as adults. They derive pleasure from killing, and each crime intensifies their desire to kill. They often feel inadequate and thus target weaker victims to achieve psychological balance. Typically, these individuals do not forcibly abduct victims, but lure them to secluded places using deceitful methods, with candy being a common tool for enticement. Indeed, candy wrappers had been found at the scenes of the discovered bodies, including Marta's. Edward believed that the killer used fruit candies to lure the girls. He sent the candy wrappers to the University of Quito for analysis. Unfortunately, due to the limited technology of the time, no fingerprints were recovered from the candy wrappers. The case was stalled until early February 1986, when a 12-year-old girl named Gloria Andino was found dead in a mangrove swamp. She had also been brutally harmed, with her face unrecognizable like Marta's. However, she was clutching a candy wrapper tightly in her hand. This discovery invigorated the police. Although the previous candy wrappers had deteriorated, making the fingerprints unusable, this new wrapper was carefully preserved by the girl. It was a crucial lead. The wrapper was quickly sent to the Quito laboratory, where a partial fingerprint was extracted from the corner. The fingerprint was then sent to Chicago for further analysis. After several hours of processing, a complete fingerprint from the right index finger was obtained. The following day, Quito police sent copies to major cities in Ecuador and Colombia for comparison. Soon they received matches from Bogotá, the capital of Colombia, and Barranquilla, a northern port city in Colombia. A detailed comparison confirmed that these fingerprints matched the one obtained from the candy wrapper. The fingerprint belonged to Daniel Camargo Barbosa. Camargo's first stop in Ecuador was the capital city, Quito, in the Andes. However, on the cold night of December 5, 1984, he decided to return to the coast. A few days later, on December 18th, Camargo abducted and killed a 9-year-old girl in Quevedo, Ecuador. Between 1984 and 1986, he continued his spree, committing at least 55 murders of young girls and adult women. Most of these murders occurred in Guayas province, but he also committed crimes in Quito, Machala, and Ambato. During this period, Camargo supported himself by working as a porter in the markets of Guayaquil or by selling clothes and belongings taken from his victims. Initially, the police believed the murders were linked to organized crime. Numerous rumors pointed to white slave trafficking rings, satanic cults, or powerful individuals protected by the police. There was no doubt that the man named Camargo was the perpetrator of the serial murders. With this crucial lead, Edward was overjoyed. A few days later, even better news arrived. While Edward was reviewing Camargo's files at the police station, newly assigned Quito police officer Juan Rosales was walking down a muddy road leading to the outskirts of the mangrove swamps. He noticed a middle-aged man furtively emerging from dense bushes carrying a black plastic bag. Rosales parked his car at the roadside and approached the man. The man, disheveled but with a calm demeanor, introduced himself as Manuel Bergalin Solis and answered Rosales' questions with a smile. When Rosales checked the black plastic bag, he found a dirty pair of blue jeans, seemingly belonging to a young girl, and a photograph of the girl in the jeans' pocket. "Whose belongings are these?" Rosales asked with growing suspicion. "They belong to my daughter. I picked them up from a classmate's house. She stayed over there a few days ago and forgot to bring the jeans back, so I went to retrieve them." The man answered calmly. Despite the man's seemingly harmless appearance and his composed responses, Rosales was thrilled and nearly burst into cheers on the street. The girl in the photo, Guadalupe Herrera, had been featured prominently on the front pages of Ecuadorian newspapers for months. The previous night's Quito TV report had highlighted her as one of the missing girls. Rosales was certain that this unkempt man with a slight eye problem was the serial killer who had shocked Ecuador. Before Camargo could react, Rosales swiftly subdued him, handcuffed him, and put him in a police car. After a quick verification by the Quito police, Camargo was transferred overnight to the Guayaquil police station. Initially, Camargo denied being the serial killer, but Edward did not believe his claims. After threatening him with harsh measures, Camargo quickly confessed to his crimes under the pressure. Camargo was a killer who exclusively targeted females, particularly young girls. His preferred victims were often from poor backgrounds, such as farm workers, maids, and students transitioning from elementary to higher education. He would approach his victims under the pretense of being a foreigner looking for a new pastor at a church in the suburbs. With his education, Camargo spoke fluent English and Portuguese, which made his lies more convincing. He would offer small rewards like money, candy, or pens to entice the girls to take him to the church. For older girls or women, he used the promise of work at the church to lure them. The actual murders usually took place in remote, forested areas that required a bus ride to reach. Once in the woods, Camargo would walk a distance, hide in the vegetation, and claim he was familiar with the area and knew a shortcut to their destination. If a victim became suspicious and refused to follow him, Camargo would not try to force them, but would instead look for new victims. If his lure was successful, Camargo would use a knife to threaten the victim and kill them in secluded areas using various methods. After killing, he would steal the victim's clothing and any valuables and leave the body for scavengers to consume. He always carried a spare shirt to change into, leaving behind the blood-stained clothes. He would wash the blood off his hands using urine. Camargo paid close attention to details about his victims, including scars, tattoos, and moles. Occasionally, he even obtained their family members' phone numbers and taunted them after the crimes. After briefly confessing to his crimes, Camargo led the police to various crime scenes. In a swampy redwood forest on the outskirts of Guayaquil, he pointed out several small mounds of dirt, confessing that they contained the bodies of his victims. When the police dug up the mounds, they discovered over a dozen highly decomposed bodies, many of which were missing limbs. Camargo then guided the police to additional locations in Guayaquil and Quito, where they found 9 more bodies. By November 1989, during the trial, he had confessed to 16 cases, and the police, following his directions, found the bodies of victims in 5 cities near Quito. In total, Ecuadorian authorities found 55 bodies of young girls within Ecuador, and with the additional cases in Colombia, the total number of discovered remains reached 71. Camargo had brutally killed 72 young lives. However, these were not all of Camargo's crimes. There were many missing vagrants and cases where the crimes could not be confirmed, which he himself could not fully remember. The chief prosecutor of Guayas province, in a TV interview, assured the public that the strictest punishment would be imposed on Camargo. Unfortunately, Camargo was ultimately sentenced to only 16 years, which was the maximum penalty in Ecuador at that time. On November 13, 1994, while sitting in his cell, Camargo was attacked by a new inmate, 29-year-old Giovanni Alcesio Noguera Jaramillo. Noguera forced Camargo to kneel and, after declaring, "The time for revenge has come," stabbed him 8 times, killing him. He also cut off one of Camargo's ears as a trophy. Noguera showed the ear to the guards, claiming that his family was one of Camargo's victims and that he had sought revenge for them. With no one coming forward to claim Camargo's body, he was buried in a public grave at El Batan Cemetery in Quito. He was 64 years old at the time of his death. This case highlights a broader issue. In countries with less severe penalties, the frequency and brutality of criminal cases tend to be higher compared to those with harsher punishments. Severe penalties often act as a final deterrent for those who might otherwise commit heinous acts. Camargo is a stark example of this phenomenon. An extremely dangerous criminal is terrifying, but a criminal who is skilled at disguise is even more so, because you never know what thoughts lie behind that smiling face. An extremely dangerous criminal will reveal their twisted mind, but a criminal who is good at disguise can hide those dark thoughts, showing only a gentle and harmless side. Such people are often more evil than the former. The story takes place in Los Angeles, California. Located in the southwestern part of California, Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States and is often referred to as the City of Angels. According to FBI research, in 1990, the combined murder rates of New York and Los Angeles accounted for 13.8% of all murders in the United States. In the 1970s, serial killer Rodney James Alcala murdered at least 9 women and girls across the country, though the true number of deaths is likely over 100. He was imprisoned for sexual assault but continued to rape and kill after being released. Autopsies of some victims revealed that he would strangle the women until they lost consciousness, then wait for them to regain consciousness before ultimately killing them. On July 24, 2021, Rodney James Alcala, known as the Dating Game Killer, died at a hospital near a California prison at the age of 77. Rodney earned the nickname Dating Game Killer after appearing on the reality TV show The Dating Game in 1978. In 1980, he was sentenced to death for the murder of 12-year-old Robin Christine Samso. In 1984, the California Supreme Court overturned the conviction and Rodney's murder case was retried. In 1986, Rodney was sentenced to death for the second time for the murder of Samso. However, in 2003, the federal appellate court overturned this sentence. In 2010, an Orange County jury convicted Rodney of 5 counts of first-degree murder. The killing of Samso, the 1977 murder of 18-year-old Jill Terry Barcombe and 27-year-old Georgia Marie Wickstead, the 1978 murder of 31-year-old Charlotte Lee Lamb, and the 1979 murder of 21-year-old Jill Marie Parenteau. He was sentenced to death for the 3rd time. Rodney was born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas, in the central United States. He had 2 sisters, and when he was 8 years old, the family moved to Mexico with their father. However, 3 years later, his father abandoned the family, leaving the young Rodney and his sisters to endure a harsh life. Eventually, they had no choice but to move back to the United States with their mother, settling in a suburb of Los Angeles, where they struggled to get by on her meager salary. Rodney was very good-looking from a young age, and the neighbors adored him. He was also smarter than his peers. However, during his teenage years, he began to exhibit a unique personality. He was reclusive, withdrawn, and indifferent to the warmth and care of those around him. In 1961, at the age of 17, Rodney joined the U.S. Army, where he worked in a clerical role. His IQ test score was an impressive 160, far above the average IQ range of 85 to 115, indicating that Rodney was a genius. In 1964, at the age of 21, Rodney was diagnosed with a mental disorder. A psychiatrist in the military later diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, also known as sociopathic personality disorder. This condition is characterized by high levels of aggression, a lack of shame, and severe social impact. It typically begins to manifest in childhood or adolescence and can persist into adulthood or throughout a person's life. Due to the severity of his antisocial personality disorder, Rodney was discharged from the Army by military psychiatrists. After his discharge, he used his exceptional abilities to enroll in the UCLA School of Fine Arts. If his life had continued on this path, it could have been remarkable, but in reality his inner world was deeply dark, and he pursued these studies only to better disguise himself. In 1968, Rodney graduated from the School of Fine Arts, and it was from this year that he began his criminal journey. One day, a little girl was about to walk to school when a beige, unlicensed car started following her. A passing driver witnessed the scene and saw the man in the car stop, holding some snacks, and invite the little girl into the vehicle. The passing driver found this suspicious and followed the beige car to an apartment building. Along the way, he called the Los Angeles Police Department to report the strange situation. Coincidentally, a police officer was patrolling Sunset Boulevard at the time, and after receiving the report, he immediately headed to the apartment. When the officer arrived at the apartment, he knocked on the door and said, "Hey, I'm the police. Open the door. I need to talk to you." A man appeared at the door with an extremely sinister look on his face. He said, I was taking a bath. Give me a moment to get dressed." The officer gave him 10 seconds, but after a few minutes passed with no sound from the door, the officer, sensing something was wrong, kicked it open. After checking the living room and finding no one, he walked into the kitchen. On the floor lay a naked little girl, covered in bruises and with blood still flowing from her head. The kitchen was splattered with blood and marked with drag marks, and a photo of the girl was discarded on the ground. Next to the girl was a metal bar with clear marks of strangulation. The officer initially suspected it was used to strangle the girl into unconsciousness. He checked for her breathing by placing his fingers on her nose but found none. Believing she was dead, he frantically searched the house for the perpetrator, who had already escaped through the window minutes earlier. Returning to the kitchen, the officer noticed that the girl's chest was rapidly rising and falling, indicating she was still trying to breathe. He immediately alerted the Los Angeles Police Department to clear the traffic and transported the girl to the hospital as quickly as possible. After medical examination, it was found that the girl had been repeatedly assaulted and had injuries from the metal bar. Fortunately, after emergency treatment, the girl survived, but remained in a coma for over a month and needed several more months to recover before being discharged. The little girl was 8-year-old Tali Shapiro, a sweet and innocent child. After her release, Tali's parents moved from Los Angeles to Mexico to help her recover psychologically. In an interview later, Tali said, "I don't remember going up to the apartment, and I don't remember anything after that." Meanwhile, a large number of police officers began searching the apartment. They found numerous pieces of photography equipment and a large number of photos, all of which featured young girls. They also discovered the perpetrator's ID card, identifying him as Rodney James Alcala, a student at UCLA. The Los Angeles police then contacted a professor at UCLA to inquire about Rodney. The professor said, "Yes, to us, he seemed like a good person. He would never harm anyone." Meanwhile, Rodney, who had fled, changed his name to John Berger and enrolled in the New York University Tisch School of the Arts, where he studied filmmaking under the renowned French director Roman Polanski. On June 24, 1971, a woman named Cornelia Michael Crilly, a 23-year-old TWA flight attendant, was murdered in her New York neighborhood. She had recently moved to this area, which was known for being home to many flight attendants and secretaries. Her boyfriend, Leon Borstein, described Cornelia as having a beautiful face and a very polished demeanor. On the day of the move, Borstein found her door locked and received no response when he called her. When the police arrived, they discovered a shocking scene. Cornelia was naked, strangled with her own nylon stockings, and had bite marks on her breasts. At the time, New York City had a high murder rate, with nearly 2,000 murders in 1971, making it difficult for the police to solve Cornelia's case. The lack of widespread DNA technology and the absence of any suspects led to the case becoming a cold case. In the same summer that Cornelia was murdered, Rodney obtained a job as a counselor at a children's arts camp in New Hampshire, where he taught kids how to make films. At this time, he was using the alias John Berger. In 1971, two campers recognized Rodney, who was wanted by the FBI, and reported him to the police. After his arrest, he was extradited back to California. However, an unexpected complication arose during preparations for his trial. The previous victim, Tali, had moved to Mexico with her family, and her family refused to let her testify in Rodney's trial to protect her privacy. Due to the lack of a key witness, the judge could not convict Rodney and had no choice but to release him. Less than 2 months after his release from prison, Rodney lured a 13-year-old girl to the edge of a cliff and harmed her. This time, with both witnesses and evidence, Rodney was sentenced to 2 years in prison. After serving his sentence, he was again released on parole. After his release from prison, despite his criminal record, Rodney used his charisma and knowledge of art and film to disguise himself as a professional photographer, photographing hundreds of women. Gradually, Rodney used his reputation as a locally known photographer to approach his victims, most of whom were women. He would first incapacitate and subdue them, then torture them until they died in fear, and finally take their earrings as trophies. Rodney's next victim was Ellen Hover, a 23-year-old musician and artist. Ellen was a sweet person with a gentle soul. She came from a prominent entertainment family. Her father owned the famous Hollywood nightclub Ciro's, and her godfathers were Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin. On July 15, 1977, Ellen disappeared. When the New York police began their investigation, they found only a calendar note that mentioned she was going to meet someone named John Berger. On November 9, 1977, Rodney lured 18-year-old runaway Jill Terry Barcombe with smooth talk. After engaging in inappropriate behavior, he brutally killed her and left her body on a hillside near Hollywood. To prevent identification, he used rocks to disfigure her face and head, then ended her life using belts, stockings, and pants in 3 separate instances. On December 16, 1977, Rodney committed similar acts against 27-year-old nurse Georgia Marie Wickstead in his Malibu apartment. He struck her head with a hammer, strangled her with stockings, and left her naked in the bathroom. On June 24, 1978, Rodney engaged in inappropriate acts with his legal secretary, 31-year-old Charlotte Lee Lamb, in his apartment. He then beat her and strangled her with shoelaces, leaving her in the laundry room of an apartment building in El Segundo. On September 3, 1978, Rodney appeared on a dating show called The Dating Game. Clearly, the show staff did not thoroughly investigate Rodney's background, as the host introduced him as a successful photographer, skilled in skydiving and motorcycle riding. Many of the female contestants were impressed by his charming smile and smooth talk. Cheryl Bradshaw, Rodney's on-screen date, received an invitation from him after the show, but declined without hesitation. She said, "My intuition told me Rodney was dangerous. He repeatedly suggested spending a special night together, but I felt scared and even got goosebumps." On February 14, 1979, Rodney picked up 15-year-old Monique Hoyt in Riverside County. He drove her to his apartment where they spent some time in the room. The next day, they went to a secluded mountainous area where Rodney took inappropriate photos of her and images of her being harmed. He then bound and gagged her, continuing the assault. While Rodney was in a gas station restroom on the way back to Riverside County, Monique managed to escape and reported the assault to the police. However, Rodney's mother posted his bail. On June 13, 1979, 21-year-old computer operator Jill Marie Parento left work early to attend a baseball game. The next morning, when she failed to show up for work, police visited her Burbank apartment and found signs of forced entry. Jill was discovered dead, naked on the bathroom floor, having been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. On June 20, 1979, 12-year-old Samantha Samso went missing while biking to her ballet class in Huntington Beach, California. 12 days later, police received a tip and discovered Samantha's body on a hillside. Due to the hot weather, the body had decomposed significantly, and the coroner could not determine if she had been sexually assaulted. Investigators later found Samantha's earrings in a storage locker rented by Rodney. Following this lead, Rodney was immediately arrested and charged. However, a woman testified that Rodney had not been to the beach, but police dismissed her testimony, suspecting she might be romantically involved with Rodney and potentially providing false evidence to cover up his crimes. In 1980, Rodney was sentenced to death by the Orange County Superior Court. However, this verdict was overturned by the California Supreme Court due to police misconduct. Specifically, they had informed the jury of his criminal history prematurely, which could have biased their decision. Additionally, the evidence, which consisted of only a single earring, was deemed insufficient to conclusively prove his guilt. In 1986, after new evidence was collected, Rodney was retried and convicted of first-degree murder. In 2001, a U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals panel overturned the death sentence, ruling that a key witness who had discovered the body had not testified in court due to memory issues. The absence of this crucial witness led to another legal stalemate. While in prison, Rodney wrote a book claiming his innocence and sought compensation from the government for his incarceration. By 2003, DNA testing had become a standard tool in criminal investigations. Since the establishment of the first national DNA database in 1995, many countries had followed suit, and by this year, 76 countries had either established or planned to establish DNA databases. DNA analysis revealed that the DNA found at 2 previous rape scenes in Los Angeles matched Rodney's DNA. Additionally, DNA extracted from an earring found in Rodney's storage locker matched the DNA of the victim, Samso. With this conclusive evidence, Rodney could finally be convicted. Moreover, the police identified Rodney as the perpetrator in 4 additional murder and rape cases: 18-year-old Jill Barcombe, 27-year-old Georgia Wixted, 31-year-old Charlotte Lamb, and 21-year-old Jill Parento. In addition to these confirmed cases, authorities suspected Rodney might be involved in over 100 other murder and rape cases. However, due to the passage of time or lack of critical evidence, these cases could not be pursued further. In 2006, prosecutors brought charges against Rodney for the newly confirmed 4 murder cases, along with the previously known Samso murder case. The California Supreme Court approved the prosecution. In February 2010, Rodney faced trial for the 3rd time, this time for 5 counts of murder. The 5 victims had all been sexually assaulted and then killed. This trial saw Rodney defending himself without a lawyer. During the trial, Rodney demonstrated his high intelligence and psychological composure, responding to questions with a calm and detached demeanor, even joking and smiling in court. Over the course of 5 hours, he played multiple roles in the case, even engaging in self-questioning and answering. However, despite his eloquence, he could not refute the overwhelming DNA evidence. Additionally, the then 8-year-old victim Tali courageously testified in court. Seeing no way out, Rodney ceased his defense and ultimately requested the judge not to sentence him to death, a request that was not granted. In 2010, the New York police released 215 photographs taken by Rodney, hoping to identify unknown victims. The photos showed women ranging from their teens to their 30s, from various states across the U.S. Many families recognized their missing loved ones among the images. The police also had over 900 more photos that were not released due to privacy concerns. In 2016, Rodney was also implicated in the 1977 murder of Christine Ruth Thornton in Wyoming, but prosecutors chose not to extradite him for trial. Additionally, police suspected him of killing Pamela Lamson in the San Francisco Bay Area in the fall of 1977. However, the DNA collected from that crime scene was too degraded to test, so no charges were filed. Rodney died on July 24, 2021, while awaiting execution in California at the age of 77. Perhaps around us, there are some antisocial personalities quietly hiding. Studies suggest that 1 in every 25 people may have such traits, a proportion that seems surprisingly high. Fortunately, most of these individuals are not murderers and do not commit such violent acts. They are unburdened by emotions, clever and manipulative, with unpredictable personalities but without anxiety. They are skilled at disguise and approach problems with calm, clarity, and organization. Although they are fully aware of societal norms, they are indifferent to them. In reality, their pursuit is solely for their own goals, and they are willing to use any means necessary to achieve them. On August 28, 1999, in Manchester Prison, a young man suspected of being a serial killer hanged himself. He made a noose out of a bedsheet and hung it from the iron bars of his cell window, choosing without hesitation to end his life in this way. Before his suicide, he wrote a letter. In it, he expressed to his mother that he could not rid himself of the obsession with killing. The letter read, "I couldn't take any more of feeling like how I do now, always wanting to kill." This young man had once told a doctor in the prison hospital that every night, as he lay in bed, he would think about murder. After his arrest, he had already attempted suicide by overdosing on medication, but he was resuscitated in time. As a result, he was placed in the prison's healthcare ward to prevent further suicide attempts. 2 days before his hanging, a staff member discovered that he had a sharpened toothbrush and had fantasized about kidnapping a female staff member, but he did not succeed. With his successful suicide, he avoided being tried for the murders he was accused of, which included the killing of 3 elderly people in Blackpool and 2 other murders on the Isle of Man. This young man's name was Stephen Oladimeji K. Akinmerele. On March 16, 1978, Akinmerele was born in Nigeria. He was of mixed race, with a Nigerian father and a mother from the Isle of Man in the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, his family was not harmonious, and growing up in such an environment, Akinmerele felt deeply repressed. He tried to mediate between his parents, but his efforts were in vain. When his parents eventually separated, he moved with his mother to the Isle of Man. Upon arriving on the Isle of Man, Akinmerele's mother, needing to earn a living, left him in the care of his grandmother. His grandmother was a very strict person, imposing rigid discipline on him, and even simple relaxation was not allowed. As a result, Akinmerele lived in constant fear and anxiety. In this stifling environment, Akinmerele's mental state became increasingly fragile, and his mind started to become unstable. At the age of 11, Akinmerele began to show violent behavior toward elderly people, such as verbal abuse, pranks, and intense hatred. This pathological hatred seemed akin to a mental illness. Even though Akinmerele often got into trouble at school, he appeared very friendly to his peers and others. It was only toward the elderly that he displayed a strange and hostile attitude. After these incidents, Akinmerele's mother realized her son had severe psychological issues. She decided to remove him from his grandmother's care, quit her job, and began spending every day with him, just to try and help him live a happier life. In May 1995, the body of a 72-year-old elderly woman, Marjorie Ashton, was found in her home in Ballasalla on the Isle of Man. The cause of death was strangulation. In February 1996, a 68-year-old woman, Dorothy Harris, who was partially blind and deaf, died in a fire at Glasson Terrace on the Isle of Man. By 1996, Akinmerele had turned 18 and moved to Blackpool, one of the UK's most popular seaside resorts. At this time, Akinmerele found a job as a civil servant. He worked hard, even taking on a part-time job at a local pub. During the day, he organized documents at the welfare office, and at night, he worked as a bartender. Akinmerele even started dating a woman named Amanda Fitch. However, due to the psychological issues stemming from his childhood, Akinmerele secretly associated with vagrants and drug addicts. He enjoyed mingling with them and soon became addicted to alcohol and drugs. He also developed a habit of stealing and would give the stolen items as gifts to Amanda Fitch. Although Akinmerele appeared to be living a normal life with his girlfriend on the surface, deep down he harbored violent and murderous impulses. In September 1998, a 75-year-old woman, Jemima Cargill, died in an apartment fire on Const Street in Blackpool. Due to the destruction of evidence, most people believed she might have died from smoke inhalation during the fire. She had previously been Akinmerele's landlord. On October 30th, 1998, an elderly couple, Eric Boardman, 77, and his wife Joan Boardman, 74, were found dead in their home. Their bodies were discovered by their daughter. Eric's body was found next to a closet in the hallway, and when the police moved his body, they found a blood-stained metal rod on the floor. This metal rod was crudely assembled from 6 batteries and white tape. Joan's body was found in the living room with no visible signs of injury. The autopsy revealed that Eric had sustained injuries to his head, neck, and face, while Joan only had injuries to her neck. Both were determined to have been strangled to death. Based on the investigation, it is believed that on the day of the incident, the sequence of events likely unfolded as follows. The killer had secretly entered the Boardman's home in advance and remained hidden, unnoticed by the elderly couple. The next morning, when Eric left the house, the killer found Joan resting in the living room and strangled her from behind. When Eric returned home, he discovered Joan lying in the living room with the killer nearby. Mistaking his wife's condition as just having fainted, Eric, a husband trying to protect his wife, did not call the police or seek help, but instead bravely confronted the killer. A fierce struggle ensued, but because the killer was armed with a homemade metal rod, Eric suffered severe head and facial injuries and was eventually strangled to death by the killer. Eric Boardman and Joan Boardman were friends in their younger years. Both had been married and divorced, but one day they met again on the Blackpool seafront. They shared their stories with each other, and soon after they got married and spent 27 happy years together. In the 1960s, Eric Boardman was well known in the maritime community in Blackpool, frequently taking vacationers on boat trips along the Field Coast. Joan Boardman was also well known in the neighborhood, always lending a helping hand to her neighbors. Everyone remembered her fondly. She always had a smile on her face and would greet people every morning no matter what. One neighbor said, "I'm really shocked. I just can't believe it. It's so sad." This is a quiet street, and we all knew her well. Joan was a very nice lady. I used to sometimes see her with her daughter in Morrison's or Marks and Spencer, and she would always ask how my mom was doing. She was just a very nice lady. Joan used to give bones to my dog and even put them in the mailbox. She was the kind of person you'd always greet if you saw her. But because of Eric's struggle, the killer's plan was completely disrupted. The killer tried to make their deaths look like an accident by knocking over the closet. If his plan had not been disrupted, he might have started a fire to destroy the evidence. Following an investigation, fingerprints and traces of the killer's blood were found on the metal rod and on Eric's body. Through DNA and fingerprint comparison, the killer's identity was revealed to be Stephen Akinmurele. Stephen Akinmurele, 20 years old, was arrested on November 1st, 1998 on suspicion of murdering Eric and Joan Boardman. However, after Akinmurele's arrest, detectives discovered that Jemima Cargill, who had died previously, was Akinmurele's former landlord. Given Akinmurele's potential involvement, detectives began investigating the cause of Jemima Cargill's death. They found that her case appeared more like a murder than an accidental death. At this point, Akinmurele was charged with 3 murders. As the investigation deepened, detectives noticed similarities between the deaths of Marjorie Ashton and Dorothy Harris with that of Jemima Cargill. As a result, Akinmurele was charged with a total of 5 murders. Dorothy Harris's brother, Ted Halsall, stated that he had no doubt Akinmurele was responsible for his sister's death. While in custody, Akinmurele also confessed to another murder. He claimed that he had killed a hiker on the Isle of Man and buried the body on a cliff overlooking the sea. Following a search, the Manx police found a gun with Akinmurele's fingerprints, but despite extensive excavation, they did not find the hiker's body. Detective Superintendent Bob Denmark, who led the investigation, said, "I personally interviewed him, and I believe he is one of the most dangerous individuals I've ever encountered. I was always concerned about his tendency to kill and the risk he posed to others, whether in custody or not." While in prison, Akinmurele was questioned by several experts, including doctors and a psychiatrist. According to the psychiatrist who evaluated Akinmurele, he said he felt disturbed by images of the victims, which constantly played in his mind. He must have gained some emotional gratification from it. Murder is not a spontaneous crime. He selected his victims. I do not believe he was mentally ill. The evil within him took over. But he was clearly a troubled young man. This was pure violence against elderly women, with each of them being strangled, a very intimate way to kill. The killer witnesses life leaving the victim, and the victim can see the eyes of the person who is taking their life. In July 1999, Akin Morelle overdosed on medication but was promptly taken to the hospital. There, he told doctors that the souls of his victims were haunting him and tormenting him continuously. His girlfriend, Amanda Fitch, had warned the police about his strong suicidal tendencies. She said, "Akin Morelle told me he wished the police had never found him. He didn't want to face trial." On August 28, 1999, just a few days after being returned to prison and weeks before his trial was set to begin, Stephen Akin Morelle hanged himself in his cell. In his suicide note, he confessed to all the murders. He explained his reason for suicide. "I cannot continue to live with this constant urge to kill. I know it is wrong, but I cannot rid myself of it. I cannot continue down this path that I know is wrong, but I know that if given the chance, I would kill again. I do not want to live with this madness any longer, so I must say goodbye to everyone." In the letter, he also confessed to 3 additional murders of young people. However, the police were skeptical of this confession, claiming it was an attempt to obscure the fact that all his known victims were elderly. A family member of one of the victims said, "When we heard about his death, it was more comforting than anything else. The comfort comes from knowing that it's truly over and our family did not have to endure the trauma of a court case. We did not want to know whether he could have been back on the streets in time. We feel sorry for his mother, but from our perspective, I think relief is the best word to describe our feelings." There is a strong possibility that this case has other interpretations. For example, Akin Morelle might have been framed due to his mental illness. In all the news reports, or from people who knew him, there was no mention of him having any diagnosed mental illness, not even from his girlfriend who lived with him every day. However, this is just speculation and cannot be considered as evidence.